Just a brief health and safety notice. Please keep the aisles clear during the proceedings. In the event of a fire alarm, please make your way to the nearest fire exit. There are 4, 1 in each corner of the hall. The main assembly point is just outside Orris-Lamach Lane, the students' building in which we are, outside and opposite, the O'Donoghue Theatre. Anish bottom fáilte a chur ribh ard Rooney na rinne cosanta Jackie McCrum.
Good morning. You're all very welcome to this morning's proceedings. I've agreed with our Margaretta Darcy here that she will just intervene just for a short time at the beginning of the forum.
A very simple question. Why do we not have a citizens' assembly first before the national forum? The citizens' assembly, 99 people chosen at random, age, nationality, social conditions. It is a fair example of the Irish society, unlike this forum, which of course I'm not against. I'm not saying we shouldn't have a forum, but I'm saying is, let us have the 99 citizens chosen at random before this selected forum. Now, Tánaiste, you have read Michael D. Higgins, and he has absolutely cast a lot of doubts on this forum. So I'm asking you, and I believe that you did promise us a citizens' assembly, but let's have it first, not the stitch-up, which is what's going to happen at the forum. I just like to ask all of you, do you agree that we should have a citizens' assembly first before the forum?
Okay, Margaretta, thank you so much now for that intervention. I'm going to.
And it is just amazing that they've made such a bloody fuss bringing the guards and everything, because I'm asking this simple question.
Thank you, and
assembly.
Margaretta, that's excellent, and thank you so much. So I am now going to just assist Margaretta, and the President of the University of Galway, Ciarán O'Hogarty, is going to take the stage to start the proceedings today. Thank you very much.
So tá fáilte ó bhélig ar maidin agus fáilte go diolch gona Galway agus fáilte Margaretta freisin céimi ionig Margaret, an honorary graduate of ours, agus tá Galway an ollscoil se oscailte go dtí ollscoil oscailte muid tá muid oscailte a gcónaí agus I always say we're a university with no gates and university for the public good. And key values of ours are 2 values: openness and respect, the greatest of these being respect. And we're particularly pleased, therefore, to welcome a variety of voices here today, and particularly pleased to welcome the forum to Ulster Galway University of Galway, a Tánaiste, Cathaoirleach Louise Richardson. Very pleased to welcome you to Galway, and Vera Eddie Hoare. And to all of you as well, you're very welcome to the university, and we're very pleased to host the forum. We're also, as a university for the public good, have for example, here the Irish Centre for Human Rights, and you've colleagues from the centre speaking today. We have long associations with the Defence Forces from 1969, And we also, through our graduates, have made a significant difference to the matters under debate today. So a graduate of this university, the first member of and chair of its governing authority was Noel Dore, a well-known diplomat. We have today also with us Gerard Hearn, who's a member of our governing authority, former member of the Defence Forces. Maureen O'Brien was honoured last week, who's working with the UN in a senior position in peacekeeping. And we also last week honoured Jim Clerkin, who's an advocate in Oxfam for peace and security throughout the world. Really important voices for us. And our graduates make a difference. And that is also part of our contribution, I think, to public debate. Significantly over time, we've had diplomats, public advocates, and people who speak and with good voice and open voice. And we're particularly pleased, therefore, for today to welcome you here too. So, as I mentioned, Noel Dore, Gerard Hearn, Fiona Niconica is here, a graduate of ours, the Ambassador to Colombia, Michael D. Higgins, a graduate of ours. And we here are open to discussion, to debate, to dissent in a respectful manner. And the forum is part of that. I think the Tánaiste and the chair are also very much a part of that. This is a public forum and open for public debate on a very important issue. So, Gamin Mahagavilig. We are a university for the public good with values of respect and openness, respectful debate and dialogue. Agus mar sin tá muid fríomhhaochtaí vas bheith anseo, agus chuir mé an Tánaiste agus an Cathaoirleach Louise Richardson an Athnadíomh, who are going to reflect on the first day, to start the forum, to reflect on the first day of proceedings in Cork. So I'll welcome Tánaiste Micheál Martin and Louise Richardson as chair of the forum. Give me a thank you. Thank you.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back, and very much warm welcome to those of you who are listening online as well. We hope you very much enjoyed the sessions yesterday. I know I learned a lot. We had 4 sessions, and we're planning to have another 4 today. As with yesterday's, the choreography will be broadly similar. We will have moderators and panels, and about half the time of each panel will be devoted to a discussion between the panelists, and the rest to questions and comments both from the floor and from those participating online. As we said yesterday, we very much hope that this debate on these really important issues will take place in a spirit of what Timothy Gorton Ash has described as robust civility, in which we engage, hear different points of view, and above all, give everybody who wishes to express a point of view the opportunity to do so. So before turning to the first panel, we're going to have a brief conversation in which I'll invite the Tánaiste to reflect on how things went yesterday and what we anticipate for the days to come. So Tánaiste, I must say, there were quite a few things I learned yesterday, and I wonder if you could tell us if there was anything you learned that you hadn't known prior to yesterday's discussions.
Well, I think a number of things. First of all, I think it was a very wide-ranging sort of debate. I attended all 4 sessions. The calibre of speakers, I think, was very high. We had a lot of international contributions. I thought those who have served in the United Nations for over a decade or so, I think, had very good insights in terms of what's happening now on the Security Council and what's happening in the United Nations in general. And particularly Ireland's, it was good to hear yesterday international speakers affirm Ireland's excellent record in terms of nuclear non-proliferation and in terms of disarmament and in terms of peacekeeping. And to hear people who were in Darfur, retired Irish soldiers who worked on peacekeeping missions in Darfur and in Chad and in Kosovo saving lives, to hear the voices of people on the ground was impactful. I think the sessions in the afternoon on cyber security and on maritime safety. A very good point I came across on maritime safety, which we probably instinctively know but probably don't give enough emphasis to, and a number of speakers said 2 things. One, we will be depending on the sea much more now in terms of both connectivity, economic development, and in terms of energy. So as we move into the offshore renewable space, and as that becomes the dominant form of energy into the future, there will be a need to secure it. As we develop interconnection, we already have interconnection with the United Kingdom, we're building an interconnector with France. Those interconnectors will have to be secure. And we will have to work with France, and we'll have to work with other countries to ensure the security of our energy infrastructure at sea. And then 97% of all internet traffic is going under the seabed, and that will have to be secured as well. And it's very complex. And coming out of that, in addition, speakers made the point, the future will be unlike anything we've experienced in the past or even in the present, which really merits then serious reflection on those issues. And then the idea, which came across strongly yesterday, we cannot do it on our own in terms of the complexity of the issues around cyber. And we had a lot of companies yesterday giving us the up-to-date in terms of the kind of attacks that countries will face from state actors, from criminal gangs, and from hacktivists, which can really disrupt the lives of citizens going about their daily lives. We saw it in the HSE with a devastating attack on our health service executive during COVID-19, and in many respects the full enormity of that was not revealed at the time because of no one wanted to give succour to those who wanted to hold the country to ransom. But it had a very severe impact on clinicians at the front line and on senior HSE officials who worked around the clock with other state agencies to try and restore the situation.
Thank you. I was very struck yesterday by the sense of enormous pride in all the international activities of Ireland over the years, from peacekeeping to engagement with various international organisations, and yet a strong sense that we shouldn't be a part of NATO. So how do we manage this dynamic of deep interconnectedness on the one hand and distance on the other?
I think one speaker yesterday described Ireland's impact, or perhaps the future trajectory or direction of travel would be, we're a small country. That has obvious implications. We're generous, is how one person described it, but we're also active. And so Irish diplomacy is very active on the international stage. I think the high point in the last number of years has been our work on the Security Council. And we earned credit for our set of values, really. What were they on the Security Council? Ensuring humanitarian corridors were kept open to Syria, which was very difficult. And there were some on the Permanent Five who were endeavouring to restrict and to veto certain actions that Ireland was promoting. So we did well on Ethiopia, although the Ethiopian government wasn't pleased. And Ireland took a lot of pressure. And in fact, our embassy staff was reduced because of taking a principled stand on ensuring humanitarian corridors to Tigray. Perhaps we were the first, really, and the small independent island states were very grateful to Ireland for putting centre stage the issue of climate and security. We nearly got there. I can recall making my opening statement when we had the presidency of the Security Council. At that stage, there was a likelihood of two permanent of the P5 vetoing or going against it. In the end, it boiled down to Russia, and Russia vetoed that resolution. But I can tell you that the small island states were particularly appreciative of Ireland, who didn't forget them. They supported us in our campaign to get on the Security Council. And I think that will happen in time, that the world unanimously will link security and climate. So I think that sort of activity, also women in conflict. We brought women from conflict zones to the Security Council and gave a very strong profile to women in conflict and the perspective of women in conflict situations all around the world. We're now going for the Human Rights Council in I think the 27-29 period. So that activity, that active engagement at the Council for Europe, we had a presidency recently. We were key catalyst in organising the first summit in a long time at Reykjavik recently, which was a success. And so that sort of activism and peacekeeping then is another vital manifestation. It's the most noble thing you can do in the world, I think, is to be a peacekeeper. And Ireland has a strong record in that respect. We have concerns as to whether the UN will ever be in a position to sanction a peace mission again, or whether various peace missions will be vetoed. But I think, as was explained yesterday, which might not be widely known, we've been part of European-led peace missions. We've been part of NATO-led peace missions, which have saved lives and which have been very effective. So the issue of the future is, how does Ireland participate in peace missions into the future? We're not a military power. Our capability is not high, so we need to be realistic about that. All sorts of assertions get made, but we're going militaristic and all that. Believe me, I'm Minister for Defence for 6 months. I don't mean this in any sort of belittling, but we're not in any shape or form a military power. But what we can do, I think we do have a lot of strength in peacekeeping and knowledge built up over the years, which we can bring to situations.
Yesterday it came out repeatedly about how critical, both for our standing but also for our worldview, is our size and location as a small country on the edge of Europe. But as a small country, we're very dependent on the international order of law, the rule of law globally. And a number of major powers have shown remarkable disrespect for international law lately. That makes us vulnerable. How do you think about this?
It's a big worry. Like, Ireland is resolutely rules-based in our approach. That is a fundamental value. We believe in multilateralism because that is essential to for example, to our economy, society, because we believe in free trade, we believe in mobility of people and so on like that. So it is under threat and it is being contested, and other powers are now endeavouring to develop alternative mechanisms. So you look at Mali, for example. Wagner now is replacing European states in respect of Mali and so forth. So I think the issue for us is to really stand firm, be active on all international fora, right across the board. I mean, if all of the major UN agencies on refugees all appreciate Ireland's contributions, which are way above proportionally many other countries. And very often, I think the true contribution that Ireland makes internationally isn't often perhaps articulated committed enough to the Irish public itself. And that's a piece of work we could usefully do.
Thank you. Well, let's look for the next 3 days. And what do you hope to achieve in the course of these next 3 days?
Above all, that we would, first of all, that we would gain greater insights, because many of these issues are complex, as we saw yesterday, and I think it was very refreshing yesterday to hear expertise on the cyber and maritime spaces alone, and also then in terms of how the world of diplomacy is changing, how the challenges and tensions within the United Nations are manifesting themselves, and the shortcomings. So that basically the public would have a greater understanding at the end of these 4 days in terms of the issues that we are facing. And also, in my view, the idea that we have to work with people, we have to cooperate. And I think at the centre of all of that is our membership of the European Union. And I have all my life, been a strong supporter of the European Union. And therein, we have an opportunity to shape things. I don't believe we should be passive in terms of, I think we should be active, shaping policy, influencing the direction of policy within the European Union. So the next 4 days, I hope we can create greater insights for people, allow for a more informed debate into the future, and that will flow into the Oireachtas, and it will flow in different fora as well.
Thank you. Well, one of my chief tasks as chair is to ensure that we stick to time. So the next panel is due to begin at 9:30, so it will. Let me say a few more words about timekeeping. We will begin every session at the time in your program, so if you are out at coffee, you'll miss the beginning. We have a lot of ground to cover, so I hope you will help us keep to time. It hasn't escaped my notice that there are people in the audience who are unhappy about this forum. Let me just invite you to express your point of view when it comes to questions from the floor. We welcome a fulsome discussion. These are complex and nuanced issues. There are no black and whites, no right or wrongs. We're trying to examine our assumptions about our role in the world, and we welcome all perspectives. So I do heartily invite everyone to express their point of view. When we open at the panel, you'll be more than welcome to address questions, to pose your questions. So with that, I would like to invite Deputy Secretary General Sonya Hyland and the first panel to come to the stage. We'll have the first panel on the lessons from Ireland's experience at the UN Security Council. But please join me in thanking the Tánaiste for his remarks.
sit there. Thank you. Thanks. I think I'm going to move my chair around a little bit so I can see you all. Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to come to this conversation. My name is Sonya Hyland. I'm the Deputy Secretary General in the Department of Foreign Affairs. I've been working on multilateral issues, particularly UN issues, for the last 4 years, including during our tenure, our preparation time and our tenure on the Security Council. Before that, I was ambassador in Ethiopia, accredited to the African Union, to South Sudan and Djibouti. Before that, I was in Mexico, accredited to a number of Central American countries as well. This panel, and in fact this whole morning and part of this afternoon, is looking at Ireland as a global actor. So who are we? What do we want to be? How do we want to behave? How do we want to make an impact and make an influence into the future? And this particular panel is about lessons from our UN Security Council membership. So most of you, I think, will know that Ireland ran for membership of the Security Council. The vote was in June 2020. We were against Norway and Canada. We had Norway, Canada and Ireland competing for 3 seats. It was a very hard-fought campaign, and happily for us, it was a hard-won campaign. We did get onto the Security Council, and we served as an elected member of the Council from 2021 to 2022 for the 2 years. Ireland, the last time we've been on the Council was in 2001 to 2002. Previous to that, we've had a pattern of being on pretty much every 20 years. This time round, we look back when we were campaigning at the agenda of the Council in 2001 and 2002, and then the agenda of the Council in 21 and 22, and it had tripled. So that just shows you the extent of which conflict had become A, more complex, and B, much more widespread. So we had a huge task to try and, I suppose, live up to and work based on the 3 principles that the government had set in advance of our tenure, which was building peace, strengthening conflict prevention, and ensuring accountability. And we prepared and we prepared and we prepared on all sorts of issues, but there were things that obviously we could never have, we didn't prepare for because we could never have foreseen, obviously the invasion of Ukraine by Russia being one of them, but also other things as well. Obviously what happened in Afghanistan in August and September 2021, but also very much so what happened in Ethiopia and the very, very grave human rights and international humanitarian law and humanitarian violations that were happening in Tigray and northern Ethiopia, which we took a lead on. So what I'm going to talk about today really is, I suppose, how successful were we? Not too much of that, because we're not here to sort of bang our own drum. More, I suppose, what did we learn? And what was the impact of our work? What opportunities were we able to take? What challenges did we face? What limitations did we face? And to talk about that with me, I have 3 extremely experienced people. And again, one of the things that we've tried to do in putting together the panels for these discussions is to bring people to this discussion who have expertise but also experience. So people who have worked both in multilateral organizations or on policy issues, but also who have worked on a day-to-day basis in really complex conflict environments. So can I introduce first, I think I'll introduce Renata first, even though you're in the middle. Renata Dwan has worked for the UN for almost 2 decades in various different capacities, including as head of UNIDIR, which is the United Nations disarmament research body. She's currently serving as a special advisor to the UN Secretary General's envoy on technology, a massively complex area and one I think that the UN is really grappling to get to grips with. You're also, Renata, a consulting fellow in Chatham House with the Centre of Humanitarian Dialogue, with the Stockholm Institute for Peace Research, and with a whole lot of other bodies that I won't go through. And again, I know you worked with the UN in Afghanistan and have worked on Haiti, Democratic Republic of Congo, Syria, and other very, very complex conflicts. And with expertise in peacekeeping, with expertise in disarmament, and with expertise on the I suppose the nexus between development and peacekeeping, disarmament, those more hard security issues. Ed Burke is Professor of History in UCD, Ed was formerly also a professor of, not history, I think strategic studies, international relations in the University of Nottingham, and has also had posts in a number of other universities and has recently written a book on the conflict in Northern Ireland. Shane Ryan was at the coalface in New York when we were doing many of the negotiations on during our Security Council tenure. Shane was particularly responsible for some of the Africa files, and as many of you will know, about 65-70% of the agenda of the Security Council focuses on Africa and African conflicts, and most of the peacekeeping missions that the Security Council mandates and authorises take place on the African continent. So I'm loath to say it was a particularly busy file, because every file was a particularly busy file, but it was a pretty busy file. Thanks, Shane, for taking the time to come, and thanks to all three of you for taking the time to come. So let me just ask, as a sort of opening question to each of you, one of the things I think that, one of the reasons that Ireland has wanted to go onto the Security Council and has campaigned hard to go onto the Security Council over a number of decades, and 4 times in fact, is because the Security Council is the one body under the UN Charter that is mandated with the maintenance of international peace and security. And the UN, to me, even as somebody who has worked on these issues for a long time, is an incredibly complicated and confusing place. There are multiple bodies, multiple agencies, multiple parts of it, but I suppose the Security Council is very much at its centre, because it is the only body that the UN Charter gives the mandate to engage on international peace and security, and that means it's the only body that can mandate peacekeeping and peace enforcement operations. So it has a very grave responsibility, I think, for the maintenance of international peace and security. And again, it's composed of 5 permanent members, all of you will know this, which have vetoes, 10 elected members which don't have vetoes. So let me go to you first, Renata, just with a very general question. The UN Charter makes clear that the Security Council, its mandate is the maintenance of international peace and security. Is it fulfilling that mandate?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious to say, if you look at the amount of conflicts in the world today, if you look at the situation in Ukraine, where the Security Council has met over 50 times, almost probably 60 times now, and has not been able to issue anything, even a statement, that it's not fulfilling its full role for the maintenance of international peace and security. I don't think that's saying something controversial. I think the question is, what do we expect of the Security Council? And is it appropriate and fair to expect it to solve the world's problems, and how do we relate to it today? And I think it's important to remember that the Security Council tried to do 2 things. It tried to reflect power and justice, and those 2 sit quite unevenly together. When it was established after 1945, after World War II, it both reflected the powers of the time, the victors of World War II, and they got the P5 seats. But it also tried to reflect equality and justice, and the fact that all states have a role to play in the maintenance of international peace and security by having elections and having the membership. And those 2 issues are sometimes in tension and contrast. So when the P5 work well together in moments of consensus, as we saw after the end of the Cold War, you had a period of time in which many things seemed possible. You had the Security Council take really far-sighted resolutions on the protection of civilians, on crimes of accountability, of saying people who bomb schools, people who bomb hospitals, situations of parties to conflict, whether you're states or non-states, that don't respect international humanitarian law, there will be accountability. And I think we'll come to it, I hope, in the questions. But I think there's this sense of the Council did make good progress. But when the tensions between the P5 are fraught, as they are right now, its ability to move and to manoeuvre is not great, and we're in that place right now. And the question is, what does that mean for elected members, like Ireland, in your time in the Council, and what does that mean for other bodies around the UN, and how to engage in that space?
Ed Burke, can I give you the same question in broad terms?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not that we, or in some ways, going back to the late 1960s or sort of the early 1970s, when there was just, very polarized opinions in the Cold War in terms of It's not actually as bad as that. I mean, the Security Council has evolved in terms of, I think Ireland has had, in terms of 1325, women in peacekeeping, or when it comes to dealing with issues, international law, that, these things didn't exist really in the late 1960s, early 1970s. In Ireland, still being able to get agreement on some of those, including the recent protection of civilians mandate that has just gone through the Security Council. So it's not to say that, and that will affect how we sort of transition from peacekeeping missions, out of that kind of that post-conflict, or hopefully what is a post-conflict phase. So I think there's still, things that can be done and are done. And if we didn't have, the Security Council to do things like provide humanitarian access to Syria, which Ireland and Norway successfully managed to do, against huge opposition initially from one permanent member state, Russia, who was trying to leverage the situation in Syria for its regional and international advantage. If we didn't have Ireland working, really, really hard, and other member states in the Security Council, I think the humanitarian situation in a place like Syria will be infinitely worse. And so, has there been retrenchment? Has there been yes. I think actually, Simon Coveney was very frank about that when he assessed, some of the disappointments of the Security Council the last 2 years. And I think that's right. I don't think we should hide the fact that Ireland has had a very, very difficult time in terms of diplomacy. But the mitigation the mitigation that's been put in place when it comes to, for example, humanitarianism, shifting, peacekeeping, has been extremely positive. And I think as well, now we're seeing in Ethiopia, Ireland was the pen holder, was the leader on that for a substantial period of time. Very few member states, including the European Union, were talking about Ethiopia and the Tigray conflict. And Ireland kept hammering away at that. And I would say, questionably, in terms of the European Union, where Ukraine was on every top heading, some people were a little bit, almost mystified why Ireland did that. But, that mattered to millions of people in Ethiopia. And I think that, we're not there yet, but November 2022, right at the end of Ireland's term, there was there was at least a cessation of major violence there. This violence continues, and we need to keep an eye on that. But so that the ability for states like Norway, Mexico, Ireland, etc., to try and to make advancement, to reform the UN, to push for humanitarian objectives, I think that's absolutely vital. And I wouldn't want to see the place where we didn't have that. It doesn't mean that, we'll talk about it later, but in terms of issues that are very important to Ireland, like non-proliferation, North Korea, obviously the UN Security Council resolution was blocked there. Ireland was also the pen holder, the leader on that. That was very disappointing. Also on issues like, there's been major tensions within the Security Council, including between the Europeans and the United States over Israel-Palestine. That's been, again, that is something that is extraordinarily frustrating. So, but I think we would be lost without it. I think Ireland has approached, I had some criticism of Ireland in its previous Security Council term, and I think the first conversation I ever had with Sonya was when she was First Secretary in Madrid, where I was quite trenchant about criticising Ireland for not actually in 2002 taking a firmer stance on the build-up to the war in Iraq. And I was annoyed about that. I thought we could have used our leverage more there, and we could have taken a firmer view. This time round, I have to say, Ireland has been very, very consistent in terms of standing up for values. So I notice a difference there. And I think that is respected. The fact that we focused on Africa, not just Ukraine. If we're going to if we're going to do things in the General Assembly now that get away from the blockages, the great power blockages in the Security Council, and do things like uniting for peace or sort of build coalitions, the African Union really does appreciate that interest. Some African states really don't agree with us, but they know that Ireland is coming from a set of principles rather than sort of major power interests. We think that those principles work for our international security in terms of rules-based order, multilateralism, etc. But I think that is appreciated, and that's really important for the future.
Shane, can I talk to you and ask you a little bit about something that Renata mentioned and also Ed alluded to, which was Syria. So one of the roles that we had on the Security Council was the Syria humanitarian file. And essentially what that means is that in northwest Syria, in Idlib, there is a sort of a pocket of the country of Syria that's not under the control of the Syrian government. And as a result, people living there are in significant humanitarian need, and it's impossible to get aid through Damascus in the normal way to them. So what needs to be done essentially is that a humanitarian corridor from Turkey into Syria needs to be maintained, and the only way that that can be maintained is through a humanitarian... Can I ask you to wait until we go to questions, and I'll take your question and comment immediately then.
You're trying to give the impression that the Russians are the cause of the humanitarian crisis in Syria.
I think there's many. I think that I'm just going to ask Shane to talk about what I'm going to ask Shane to talk about is. So I'm going to ask Shane to talk about just the practical day-to-day work that we did on that particular file. Again, as you say, the conflict in Syria and the.
Listening to you having a conversation.
We're going to go to questions and answers very shortly. So we'll have half of each session will be a panel discussion and half will be questions from the audience, and we'll go to those quite quickly as soon as I ask Shane to intervene. So Shane, you worked on the Syria humanitarian file, or you were one of the people who worked on the Syria humanitarian file. Talk to me about the day-to-day reality of what that looks like. You're trying to make sure that all of the council members will agree to keep that humanitarian corridor open. There's 4.1 million people who live in that part of Syria. 3.7 million of those are in dire humanitarian need. And one of the things that was, I think, certainly for me, most moving during our Security Council tenure was going to that border crossing, meeting the Syrian NGOs working in Syria with the civilians in that part of Syria, and hearing them say to us, "You have to do this. You have to get it right. You have to get it over the line. You have to find a way to do this, because if you don't, there are 3.7 million people whose access to vital humanitarian aid will be cut." And we actually went twice. Shane, talk to me. How did it work?
So I suppose it's important to give just a little bit of context here as well. When you look at the council, I mean, obviously you have the various different situations, and you also have the dynamics. And so the dynamics are key. So we faced a whole series of poly-crisis, as the Secretary General said, across the world. And I can go through some of the other files later on, and we'll talk about the various different situations. But the dynamics are key. And there are the permanent 5 members, as you mentioned, as well as the 10 elected members. The permanent 5 members have a veto, and they're there on the long term. They do create the stability, but the relationship between them really dictates a lot of the progress that can be made. And I think as elected members, we found our role really was to try and unblock some of the difficulties created by the difficult dynamics sometimes between the permanent 5 members. And that's, so again, just for anyone, it's the US, the UK, France, Russia and China. And so there can be very difficult dynamics. In 2021, I mean, we're going to come to obviously the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The dynamics got far worse. But even in 2021, we were talking, and it's very well known that the dynamics were already extremely difficult within the P5, and it was often difficult for them to sit together. On Syria humanitarian, this was probably the most important file and the one where international geopolitics really impacted the most. It had an effect genuinely on lives. Some of the resolutions we're talking about are thematic issues, but this is something where we're talking about 4 million people in need of humanitarian aid, and this is getting a corridor in there. In 2021, I think we worked diligently with the E10, and what was important was to try and bring the elected 10 members together and to try and then go to the permanent 5 and try and find a way forward. And we managed that in 2021. But what I would say is that in that case, in 2021, there was still a line of contact between Russia and the United States that was very, very helpful, I think, in getting that deal in 2021. If we move on to 2022, obviously with the invasion of Ukraine, the dynamics worsened considerably on the Security Council, to the point where it was much more difficult for a lot of the P5 to sit together. Usually they used to regularly meet with the Secretary General, they used to regularly meet informally, and that all essentially stopped, and they could only meet on very, very specific issues. So in 2022, when we were looking at the Syria humanitarian crisis again, we knew we had a much more difficult role. Now we had, real political engagement. We worked very hard around the system, and that means with the Security Council members and outside of that, to try and, working with civil society, working with everyone to try and understand the situation, and again, bring the elected 10 members together to try and unblock what was a very difficult situation in terms of the dynamics within the P5. Now, unfortunately, those negotiations, they were more difficult in 2022, and we came up against a veto, which I'm sure we're going to talk about. But at the end of the day, I mean, through very careful diplomacy, long nights, and I think, and that kind of unity of the elected 10 members, we managed again in, I think it was July of 2022, to get that agreement on getting life-saving aid into Syria. And I think just a final point on that, it's an example of, I think as Ed said and Renata said, how the Council is still relevant. Absolutely there are problems and absolutely there's a need for reform. But I think our abiding sense coming out of the Council is that it is still a very important part of the multilateral security architecture, that needs our attention and needs our investment.
Mm-hmm. Renata?
I think one of the reasons that we also need to think about when we look at the Council is that increasingly the Council is not tackling the solutions of conflict. It's not in there mediating an agreement and stopping the fighting. What it's doing is trying to navigate the consequences of conflict, humanitarian assistance, protection of civilians, communicating publicly a conflict. And you can say, well, that's not enough. And I certainly agree that the Council should be doing more to solve and end conflicts. But the question that I often think about working in the UN is what Dag Hammarskjöld, one of the most famous Secretary Generals, said. The UN wasn't created to bring people to heaven. It was created to prevent humanity from hell. And often you find yourself saying, well, so what can I do? Can we address this conflict, or can we try to mitigate the worst of the consequences on ordinary people and on civilians? And I do think the Council remains critical for that, particularly, and I think it's important for us to be honest, as many host states now in conflict take positions on allowing humanitarian assistance into their country that is explicitly anti. So if you don't have the Council mandating humanitarian assistance to people in Syria, or to mandating accountability for war crimes in the Congo, how else are citizens going to have access to that if their governments are not necessarily upholding international law? So I think it's important to think about that also, that the world isn't sort of the bad P5 and then the angels that are around us, but that we're navigating a space in which the Council can prise open conflicts that sometimes are very hard for external parties concerned with violations of human law, concerned with humanitarian crisis, to get involved in. And the other thing the Council does is bring public attention on a conflict. Now, that's one of the reasons why countries like Ethiopia can be very opposed to it, and why some of the African countries feel this is all about Africa, but hello, has anyone seen Asia? Has anyone seen other contexts? So that public light on a crisis or on a conflict has an important role, because it brings your attention to it. It brings all the taxpayers of the world's attention onto something. And that's also something that I don't think we can do without.
Ed, I'm just going to ask you about the veto. So Ireland has long campaigned for the end of the veto. We've said very clearly the veto is an anachronism. It has no place in the 21st century. We've long campaigned for UN Security Council reform to make the Security Council more representative, because obviously it reflects the situation back 70, 80 years ago, post-World War II, in terms of demographics and power and so on in the world, that is no longer the case, and its credibility and legitimacy as a result, I think, are hampered. What's your sense of whether, given that in order for the veto to be abolished, the P5, who have a veto, would need to agree for the veto to be abolished, what's your sense of what can be done? Because in the absence of the abolition of the veto, what can be done to try and limit the damage that having veto power can potentially cause?
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to imagine, sadly, it's very difficult to imagine the United Nations existing as the powerful institution that it is without the veto. And the most trenchant opponent, really, of the reform of that, I mean, obviously, the UK and France are very concerned about, they both, Paris and London, want to keep their, which is an anachronism in terms of geopolitical power and influence, and it's also, up Europe, it's totally lopsided, clearly. But China is very opposed to having India in the UN Security Council, and Chinese diplomats are extremely firm about this. They do not want to see Security Council affirm to have India. At present, there's border skirmishes, there's serious disagreements between the two countries. So, look, it's frankly, my assessment is it's not going anywhere quickly, and Ireland can take a principled position on it, but there is no window of opportunity presently. In terms of what we can do with the General Assembly, and I think there's a lot that can be done with the General Assembly. I think the way that Ireland cultivated relationships with Niger, for example, and climate and security was deeply unpopular amongst some, not least in Paris. The French did not like this, did not like that Ireland was pushing so hard with a number of African states to have the United Nations, to have the Security Council exposed for not dealing with this issue, for the massive economic and social problems and problems of conflict that climate is driving now, particularly in the Sahel, but in sub-Saharan Africa as well, North Africa, across the world. So I think, that was a good position to take, because we can do two things at the same time. We can stand in solidarity with Ukraine. We need to. In fact, I think we need to do more, right? But we can also, work with Niger and other countries to say that, if the General Assembly is going to be a powerful, meaningful institution, and there have been chinks of light. Renata can perhaps talk about this a little bit more. I mean, the General Assembly is a very difficult place to get things done. But the way the response to the illegal invasion of Ukraine, and the fact that so many countries from across the world, really saw that as a threat to the United Nations was very interesting. And there has been some potential out of that. But I do think it means then that Ireland needs to, unlike some other EU member states who don't, I think, give Africa and Southeast Asia and the Middle East enough attention, that you need to show that this is you don't want to dominate the agenda. Yes, there is a major European war, but if we look at the absolute devastation that has been caused now by our climate crisis, we need to, this is something that African countries, particularly right now, African member states, want to talk about a lot. So that's why I was actually genuinely, whereas, I had some criticisms of I thought that was the way we managed to do that, even though it cost us diplomatic criticism amongst our closest and most powerful neighbours. I thought that was a very good thing, actually.
Renata.
Just on this issue of the veto, so all 5 of the P5, all the permanent members, are in principle and publicly on record as saying they're in favour of UN reform. But that's a bit like saying, well, I can be comfortable in saying I'm in favour because I know that there'll be a fight. Because if every one of them says, and they by and large have all said the same thing, which is we should have better regional representation, we should have African representation, and we need to have more developing countries on the council. China has said that. So the reason that they all can be pretty comfortable about saying that is that they each fight each other off. So they know the fight between India and China will be a challenge. There is the comfort that Germany and Italy can't agree amongst each other as to who should be. Germany's the more obvious candidate. But I'm not as negative as you, maybe, a die-hard optimist. But I think that the fact that Biden came out on the General Assembly last September and said we're in reform, we support reform, is at least worth exploring and pushing. The idea of thinking about expansion of membership. And expansion of membership would require us to rethink the veto. Now, absent a veto, what are the options? Well, the French have this option for a long time saying, we commit to minimal use of our veto. So it's a self-restraint. It's saying we commit not to use the veto except in the most extreme circumstances where our own existential future as a state is at play. And there's another movement, and I'm sure Siobhan Mullally and others will know much more about, the question of when mass atrocities are committed, when you're in a genocidal situation where hundreds of thousands of civilians are at risk, you cannot use the veto, and you commit not to use the veto for those reasons. So there are options to try to force restraint. And the third thing I would say, the General Assembly took a vote, and that vote was that when the council, when somebody on the council uses a veto, they will call a meeting in the General Assembly and they will ask and call that state to explain why it used a veto. And they've already done it 3 times. And that is the first time that members of the P5 are being called to publicly account for why you chose to block a veto. And I think that court of public opinion is worth pursuing, thinking about.
Can I ask you just, Shane, about that, and then I'll do one more question and we'll go to the floor. Can I ask you just about that, Shane, the initiative that Renata mentioned, which I think is also sometimes called the Liechtenstein Initiative, which my memory is that it was approved in April 2022, May 2022, following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. What does that actually mean in practice? So why is it important that a UN Security Council permanent member, if they use a veto, has to go to the General Assembly? What does that, I mean, why is that relevant? Why is that, and also is that in any way inhibiting in terms of the use of the veto?
Yeah, so I mean, I think first thing I would say is that it's sometimes called the Liechtenstein Initiative because Liechtenstein led on it, and I think that's an important point. A very, very small member of the United Nations really having an impact. Ireland supported them, many others supported them, but it shows what small countries can do. What the initiative does, hopefully, is, and what it aims to do, is to slightly raise the cost of a veto for a permanent 5 member, that they have to go in. And we did a little bit of that on our climate and security resolution as well, where we had 113 co-sponsorships. We thought that maybe the court of public opinion, the democratic view of the General Assembly would make a difference to Russia's vote, but it did not. But I think the initiative is a way of doing the same thing. So it's hoping to raise the cost and to try and gradually move into a space where we can try and see more veto restraint, as you said, as France and the UK have done. France and the UK haven't used their veto since 1989, and they do push for restraint as much as possible. I think, look, Ed is right in the sense that there hasn't been huge movement towards reform. I would be a little bit optimistic, and the veto it's not quite reform. The veto initiative is not quite reform, but it is a step in the right direction, and we need to try and keep. I think it may also be an opening. It's possible that this veto initiative now, that the resolution can be expanded upon in the future, and that there would be increased accountability mechanisms for the P5, and we'll see how that develops as time goes on. And I think that just means that Ireland needs to continue to engage on our principal position, as you've said, that the veto is an anachronism. It's from a different time, and it shouldn't be used in any circumstances.
Right, last question, and then I'm going to start taking questions and comments from the floor. You mentioned our climate and security resolution. So one of the things I think that we wanted to do when we went onto the Council was obviously focus on the situation of countries in conflict, and we had particular responsibilities. We mentioned Syria, Ethiopia was another one, the Iran nuclear deal was another one. But we also wanted to look at thematic issues that affect countries across the board, and climate was a huge part of that, and also women, peace and security, so women's role in all aspects of peacekeeping, peacemaking, peace negotiations, peace building. The climate and security resolution that we tried to take to the Council, and Tánaiste mentioned it in his opening remarks, had the support of 113 of the 193 member states, which I think is a huge number, and as I understand it, was something of a record number, and many African countries supported it. And in fact, I think as Ed, you alluded to, it would have been absolutely impossible for us to get anywhere near where we got without the partnership of Niger. Niger was an absolutely crucial partner for us, and we worked incredibly well together. And I think it's an example of what we try and do constantly, which is work cross-regionally as well at the UN. And I suppose Niger had the moral authority in particular to talk about what the impact of climate change is on human security, what the impact of climate change is on all sorts of aspects of security. Nevertheless, despite the fact we had a huge amount of support from small island developing states, as Tánaiste mentioned, from African partners from all over the world, Russia decided to veto it. And again, just maybe you can explain a bit, Shane, what we were trying to do was actually relatively modest. We weren't trying to do something radical because we knew that wouldn't get through. It was really trying to take a first step in ensuring that the Council on a horizontal basis takes climate and its link to insecurity and problems of human insecurity seriously. Talk to me about what we tried to do.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's broad agreement that the issue of climate change has an impact on security situations around the world, and it at the very least exacerbates existing security insecurity in many parts of the world. As you said, we partnered with Niger on this initiative, as we partnered with them on UNAWAS, which is a file related to West Africa. And West Africa is actually a part of the world where, unfortunately, they've seen a rise in terrorism and insecurity and political instability. And this has all been exacerbated by climate change, and they would say that themselves. And so I think it was very appropriate that we worked with them. Now, that is not to say there isn't disagreement. There certainly is disagreement around the table as to the extent that climate actually impacts security, and there's certainly more work to be done in terms of, proving that link of climate, peace and security. Among the P5, there is a certain amount of scepticism, as we saw with the vote. But I think going forward, there are other options, other avenues for pursuing this particular agenda. I think even though it was there was a veto in this case, I think what we did was we managed to push the agenda forward. There will be opportunities now within the General Assembly. There are groups that come together to really try and look at how we can develop the expertise, and that we can develop the evidence that will, make it, incontrovertible. And I think as the years go on now, it's one of those agendas that, like women, peace and security, like youth, peace and security, like all of these other thematic agendas that will come onto the council. And what we did, I think, in real terms then, besides this particular resolution, was throughout the different mandates, and be that on South Sudan, where we had an impact, and Ireland is actually funding someone to look at climate and security within that team. And elsewhere throughout the mandates, we tried to insert language so that there would be direction for the peacekeeping missions or the political missions, wherever they are, that they would look at this and consider it and try and understand how climate is having an impact on the situation that they're trying to remedy.
Although we got huge pushback on that as well.
We did indeed. We got huge pushback. Look, we received, as we worked around the table, there were a number of member states, and I think the vote is very much public. Russia vetoed the initiative. We tried, as I said, to raise the cost of that, to show the huge support around the table, in particular from the small island developing states, who make it their signature issue because it's existential for them. But you had Russia, you have India very much opposed, and China, who abstained on the resolution. Everyone else was in favour. But I think the reality is that if Russia had not abstained, this resolution would have gone through. It had the 9 votes and not vetoed, exactly. Yeah. Or sorry, they're not vetoed. Yeah. But look, it's one of those ones we're going to continue to focus on at the United Nations. We're off the council now, but that doesn't mean that we stop. Look, it's part of that whole peace building priority that we have, and looking at all the factors that contribute to insecurity.
Good. Right, so I'm going to go to questions. Can I just remind everybody that the best way to pose your questions is through Slido. So we have the Slido function. It's www.slido.com. There should be pieces of paper on your chairs which give you the number that you need to put in when you access Slido. I'm going to look at one of my team and hope that they'll stand up and okay, that's fine. We'll also go to the floor. We'll go to the floor and we'll also go to Slido. The reason that we try and use Slido is because people can like the questions, so we get a sense of how many people are interested in a particular question, which is helpful, I think, for a large audience. The other thing just to say is that there's... I'm going to take questions in relation to this panel discussion.
Excuse me, I don't want to ask a question. I want to make a contribution.
That's fine.
Like go up there.
That's fine. I'd like everybody to make contributions from the floor, please. I'd like everyone to make contributions from the floor. I prefer to. I think what's fair for people is if everybody gets the opportunity to make a contribution from the floor, either through Slido or through going to. And I'm also just going to ask everybody to leave it for 2 to 3 minutes. So again, it's very.
This will only take a couple of minutes. Is that all right? My name is Lelia Doolan. I'm not a specialist in the matters raised here. I'm a specialist in being an Irish citizen, and like most citizens of most countries, our insights run ahead of those of most politicians. Many years ago, I decided to live my life here. For most of that quite long life, I have lived among artists, theatre and film people, and musicians, painters, writers, scholars, architects, people on the margins of Irish society, and people with little except their visions and imaginations. There's plenty of mayhem in these realms, plenty of jealousy and rage and pain, but also real understanding that fair play and peaceful making up takes inventiveness and brains, and that ordinary Irish people have plenty of both. Peace is a human need necessary for maintaining life, like eating your greens. So is independence, and so is telling the truth. War is a catastrophic issue, especially for women. Women don't start wars. Women lose their partners, their fathers, their sons, their children. Women are raped and murdered as a regular instrument of war. We're a rich country, even though we have become more of a capitalist democracy than a republic for equals. There are many things that we could do for ourselves in cooperation with others. There are many things we do. Joining military alliances and promoting the arms industry is not one of them. Being impartial peacekeepers, offering that gift to others is an actively neutral, as an actively neutral small nation, is definitely one of the things we could and should be doing. Nevertheless, a few ideas are already underway. I won't be much longer. Reform the Irish Defence Forces so that they are, unlike today, a safe place for women, with soldiers who are properly trained, paid, and resourced. Such forces to be offered to the UN for peacekeeping as of yore. Reconsider the role of the Irish Naval Service. Why send the W.B. Yeats? By the way, this is the centenary of Yeats winning the Nobel Prize for Literature. Thank you.
Make sure that everyone else in the audience gets an opportunity. There's 200 people in the room.
That's understandable. I understand that perfectly, yes. Nevertheless, you've had your say now, and it's time for some of the members of the audience to have their say, and there's plenty of time left. We could reconsider the role of the Irish Naval Service. Why send the W.B. Yeats away when she could instead save refugees' lives in the Mediterranean, as we once did, and work here at home to protect inshore fishermen? Agree that our air service is primarily a life-saving rescue service, and continue to accept the neighbouring RAF as a custodian of our airspace. Neighbours watch out for one another, don't they? We could accept the triple lock as an essential safety catch, but double the numbers involved. We need to strengthen the often embattled United Nations, as has been discussed here, and it is really amazing to me that an event of this formality should have such a sloppy presentation system as we have seen here. I assume the people who had their
individuals.
There
should be no personalised criticism, and I think
that is perfectly all right. I'm just simply saying that in general, I expected that there would be people who could come up here and tell, with a speech, what it was they wanted to say, instead of which it's a chit-chat. Anyway, we could strengthen the arts and film support borders which assist in the making of Irish film stories in the Irish and English language, driven by artistic excellence instead of simply by markets. So, what about our not completely thought-through neutrality? Shall we give up the possibility of being peace brokers along with other small nations, calling for areas of disarmament, creating mediators, as we did in days of old at the United Nations? It would be an active resource for peace, not a withdrawal into fearful isolation. As a nation that suffered a colonial past, famine and sorrow, but never attempted to rule another nation anywhere, let us revive, clarify and renew our neutrality and insert it into our Constitution along with Article 29 and announce it to the world. Sadly missing from the deliberations of this academic assembly is a hugely important element of Irish foreign policy, our commitment for decades to the peaceful development of poor peoples and nations worldwide. This policy, this finance and this work has made us partners with many nations around the globe, and beloved as a friend of the poor and oppressed, its absence here in these deliberations flies in the face of a proper consideration of our international foreign policy. Teach conflict resolutions and peace studies to all preschool and primary school children, and arrange seminars to teach.
Thank you, madam. All right.
And arrange seminars to teach politicians that Irish citizens who desire peace and non-alignment with a war like NATO or EU forces are their masters, not their subjects.
As the chair, as the moderator for this session,
Finally,
I'd like you to finish, and I'd like to give the floor to others,
commit
please.
to publishing the report on these events so that it may serve as the blueprint for a proper citizens' assembly. Thank you.
So we will already, the Tánaiste has already, just to say to everyone in the audience, the Tánaiste has already committed to publishing the chair's report. I'm going to go to Slido now. Can we have Slido up, please, on the screen? And for those of you who access Slido, 2678714. The first question that has the most, that everybody in the room is most interested in: does Ireland lack the necessary understanding of security outside of the humanitarian aid context? We don't have a national security strategy or council or advisor. Why would others take our views seriously when we don't take security seriously? Ed?
How do we know this is not fixed?
Ed? Yes. Can I ask everybody? Can I ask everybody also to put their names when they're putting when they're putting.
Whether you want to take. So at the moment we have to take.
I'd like you to please. You need to let him to speak.
We heard the intervention of the RAF there, saying that we should rely on the RAF as a friendly country.
I have to ask you to stop interrupting.
That Irish citizens should have their own information. And I trust our democracy that we should Irish people. You can both work in terms of having a national security strategy.
I'll have to ask you to please stop.
Secretariat within
you have to listen to everybody has to listen to each other.
I mean, Ireland takes advice from many countries and receives cooperation and intelligence from a wide range of, including in the United Nations. You can't do peacekeeping in the United Nations today without intelligence, so we work closely with other UN peacekeeping countries in terms of our security, getting information, getting intelligence. So I think systemizing that is okay in terms of, I think it's fine for, I think it's better than us relying upon people to tell us stuff that we can't actually then sort of check or verify ourselves. So I do think we need to increase that capability, yes, and it is something that is missing, and I think a national security strategy that would include things like protection of Ireland's commitments in the United Nations, in terms of Ireland, what Ireland wants to do in terms of its overseas deployments when it comes to women in peacekeeping, when it comes to protection of civilians. I think all these things, all these values should be encapsulated within a national security strategy. And then I do think a capability is necessary so that Irish citizens and the Irish government can actually, that we can have our own assessments, that we're not just relying upon friends in the way that we're not totally bare in terms of our own ability to analyse and collect information.
Can I ask everyone who's asking questions on Slido, please, to put their names in, and also everybody who's asking questions from the floor. Senator Crockwell, go ahead, please.
Thank you.
We do have a mic. We have somebody there. And again, I'm going to try and balance between audience, between elected representatives and members.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chair. Chair, the vexed question of Shannon has already been addressed here, and I'd like to ask the following question, if I may. Why is it that the Department of Foreign Affairs have never addressed the issues under Chapter 8 of the UN Charter? In particular, why have government never cited Articles 24, 25 and 43? In particular, in Article 43, the right of passage obligations on Ireland subsequent to Security Council authorisation, 24 and 25 supporting decisions of the Security Council. Chapter 8 subletting to regional organisations such as the EU, NATO and the African Union, etc. We seem to be deliberately diverting the Shannon debate from Ireland's UN obligations and nesting it in an obscure act of 1946. And I believe that the debate, I find it quite a vexed debate. It comes up all the time about the misuse of Shannon. It's clear that Shannon was misused in the First World War, the First Gulf War, but ever since then, Shannon has been used under UN Charter. And I'm just wondering why, and would the panel care to discuss this, why we haven't been honest with the citizens and set out the fact that Shannon is an obligation under our UN obligations. Thank you.
I'm going to go to Deputy Carthy now, and then I'm going to go to Senator Lisa Chambers, and then we'll take a number. I'll ask the panel to address some of the questions.
Matt Carthy. I'm the Sinn Féin spokesperson on foreign affairs and defence, and I think we've had an interesting conversation in respect of Ireland's role in the UN Security Council, and I think the securing of that role on the UN Security Council was a significant achievement on part of the then government and on the Department of Foreign Affairs. But it also was an international recognition of the positive and constructive role that Ireland has played in the world, and I think that needs to be acknowledged. It was and has been our long-standing military neutrality and our independent foreign policy that allowed us to have a place on the UN Security Council, and has allowed us to have the reach that we have had that goes way beyond the borders of Europe to many other continents. So that has to be the framework and the starting point from which we approach all further conversations. And what we, in my view, the debates over the next number of days, there will be attempts to suggest that the UN has almost passed its time. The UN has significant failings. The panellists have referenced them, but it's the best we have in terms of global institutional and any mechanism by which to reach multilateral consensus and achievements. And there is a distinction between UN vetoes in terms of resolutions and UN vetoes in terms of peacekeeping missions. The triple lock refers just to the second. We can be as critical of any country that tries to block progress at a UN, and we should. We should be critical of any country that uses a veto to prevent peacekeeping and to prevent conflict resolution, and we should. We should also be just as critical about those countries that breach resolutions that have been adopted, including the ongoing dismissal and ignoring of UN resolutions by Israel in relation to Palestine. And we should be just as vocal in that respect as we are in respect of the Russian breaches of international law with respect to Ukraine. And it is that independent foreign policy to be able to call out oppression and aggression wherever it is, regardless of who it is that is conducting that gives Ireland its moral authority, as President Biden called it in the Dáil when he addressed us. So I think we have a positive story to tell, and our role in the United Nations is a positive story to tell, and we shouldn't cloud it by trying to suggest that there is a better framework, there is a better mechanism, because at the moment there simply isn't. And whatever hope we have in terms of being able to ensure that there is a global order, a rules-based order, the UN is where it is at, and reform of the UN needs to be the priority from an Irish government perspective and all our international partners.
Senator Chambers? Can I go to Senator Lisa Chambers, and then I'll take a couple of questions from the floor. Senator Lisa Chambers first.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of the contributors. It was a really interesting conversation, and it was fascinating to hear about Ireland's work around the climate resolution, and the amount of background work that went into getting that level of support is to be commended, because it was no small feat. So my question really focuses on where do we go to next on that agenda, because we can feel for ourselves the climate changes in our own country. It's quite evident from the very warm summer that we're getting, record highs in the month of June, and we can just imagine then the impact that's having on African nations and small island nations. We're quite protected still. So that is the global security challenge that is present and will be the future. So where do we go to next to try and force a greater UN focus on those issues? And I think Ireland always punches above our weight, to our credit, and we are well regarded and well respected, and that's why I'm glad to see that we're having what I believe is a national dialogue, a national conversation, a listening exercise based on fact, based on evidence, and trying to remove some of the emotion out of it, because I think we owe it to our citizens and our public to present facts and evidence in a very calm and measured way, to facilitate all voices in a respectful way as well. So thank you for taking the time to discuss these issues this morning.
Thank you. I'm going to go to the panel. I see all the hands up there. I'm going to go to the panel and ask them to address any of the three questions. So, Chapter 8 of the UN Charter, which Senator Crockwell referred to, as Deputy Carthy's point about Ireland and the extent to which neutrality is what got us onto the council or is what gives us our moral authority, and Senator Chambers' question in relation to climate change and where do we go now in terms of climate change at the UN. Renata.
Well, I'm not going to address Shannon, only Senator Cockrell, because having spent my life outside of Ireland at the UN, I'm not very familiar with that issue, if you don't mind. But what I will do is come to your question on the UN and the UN reform. Look, I would say, as an Irish citizen who has worked on or in the UN for most of my life, I would say that there is a huge amount of respect, engagement, positivity around the UN. And a huge part of it is what I would call an independence in approach and a willingness to be even-handed across the board. And that goes a long way. A large part of it is being small, because smaller states are more popular in general because they have less enemies and they're active. And a large part of it is our activeness. But I don't think, and I'm just going to be honest as a researcher, it wasn't your neutrality that got you a seat. It was that notion of empathy, that notion of partnership, that notion of independence, and that notion that somebody felt you would work hard on the Security Council as honest brokers that got you onto that. That your neutrality might enable that, and that's certainly a factor to think about. What I would say, and I feel a little bit uncomfortable about this in the last few days, the debate here, is that somehow it would be really erroneous to see the world as the UN versus the EU or NATO or AU or any other regional organisation. The UN Charter sets out very clearly a role for regional arrangements. Senator Cockrell associated it in Chapter 8. It says regional arrangements can and should be established. Regional arrangements should be the first port of call for pacific settlement of disputes. Regional arrangements should be the ones to engage it. Now, it says if regional arrangements want to use force and for the enforcement, it should come to the Security Council, except for, and it goes into acts of aggression and acts of self-defense. But yes, so there's right from the beginning, there has never been a tension in UN and regional. There has been the idea that regional organisations is how the UN wants closer action to the ground to happen, but yet through transparent and legal use of force in such questions as the enforcement of force is going to be used. And I think it's really important that we bear this in mind. And then just even practically, I want us to be very clear. The UN hugely relies on the EU for funding. You can't have an African Union peace operation today without EU funding. The EU funds most of the uniforms that African soldiers use, whether under an AU context or under a sub-regional organisation. So let's inform ourselves of that debate from the perspective of where we are in that engagement.
Ed, can I ask you to address any of those questions?
Yeah, I think in terms of the Security Council, we should remember Norway also got a seat, and Norway was, is a NATO member state. Now, that doesn't mean that Ireland is going to jettison its neutrality. That's nobody's suggesting that. But Norway is a very respected leader when it comes to peace operations and peace mediation around the world. I do think that Ireland, post kind of the Security Council, I do think we need to be sort of building coalitions on certain issues within the General Assembly. So there, for example, I think the NPT was the non-proliferation treaty, and Ireland's custodianship over that has been a disappointment. We've hit so many obstacles in recent years. And I think looking to kind of new dynamic leaders in the United Nations, and indeed, if you look at Indonesia regionally now, Indonesia is such a powerful voice now. And so building those coalitions whereby new kind of, trying to encourage. We've had a traditional lead on that, but I think we need to see new leadership on Indonesia. I also think we need to see more leadership, even more GA activity on Palestine, for example. And I think Ireland is again, there's an opportunity there for certain European states like Ireland to do that. I think when it comes to, we do need to think about some of the hard work that needs to be done when peacekeeping is not simply permissive either Chapter 6, where you put a line in the sand or wherever, and you say, you stay on that side and we stay on and you stay on that side and we'll go in the middle. So East Timor, for example, in 2000, the atrocities there, I mean, certain countries took it upon themselves to do Chapter 7 peace enforcement. They weren't going to accept crimes against humanity. Is Ireland willing to actually do that hard work, or do we simply subcontract it like we subcontract other things? I think that's a big question. I think that Ireland, we can't simply just say that other countries around the world will always do the hard work, that our military will never involve itself in Chapter 7. And Ireland has been involved in Chapter 7 missions, but there are smaller countries that will take on, or similar-sized countries that will take on more leading roles in sort of difficult, more intensive, frankly more dangerous, peace support missions. That doesn't say we haven't done very important work to date. We have, but there is a question as to whether we're going to take on some more hard work in the future. And I just say, in terms of finally, with regards to the EU, I mean, we have seen in the Balkans, we're in a very delicate situation in Bosnia at the moment, where people are taking their eye off Bosnia, but really things are fragmenting very, very quickly there. And we saw in recent months that there was a huge amount of brinksmanship at the UN Security Council as to whether EUFOR, the peacekeeping mission there, for example, would be renewed. That was very, very, very dangerous, and that has a lot to do with Ukraine, right, and the gamesmanship around Ukraine. So the question arises now. Ireland did some good work there to try and get that through. A very sort of clever decoupling of certain issues that meant that certain arguments were no longer had resonance. So I think we need to think about in the future. Are we willing to do things even if there isn't a UN Security Council resolution because of that gamesmanship? It's a very difficult question, but the Balkans is an extremely fragile place right now, and I really do worry about the next year or two.
Can I just ask you, Ed, in terms of what would have happened if Operation Althea in Bosnia hadn't been renewed in terms of the UN Security Council if Russia had, as it threatened to do, used the veto? What's the international law situation in terms of that peacekeeping mission then?
It's extremely difficult. I mean, to be honest, I think one of the reasons Russia sort of decided to not veto that was because of, frankly, NATO said they would do it, right? So NATO were, and I don't think we wanted to see that. I don't think Ireland wanted to see that. I think Ireland wanted the EU to be the regional peace support organisation in the Balkans. The EU and the Balkans have that relationship. So I think, frankly, I think that in terms of the risk there, I was glad to see that we managed to get through it. There were big questions around international law, and perhaps actually Renata, if you want to get into some of those,
We'll take some more questions.
Yeah, all right, let's go. Well, so we didn't really cover Senator Chambers' question on climate change. Yes, sir, can I take your question, then your question, and then I'm going to take a question that's on Slido, which is from Donna O'Shea in relation to cybersecurity. But sir, go ahead.
Are you going to let me be heard before I have to go to a funeral?
I've given
Madam Chairperson,
the gentleman the chair.
Just a few short remarks. Firstly, the view of the panel on the future of the EU, not the EU, but the UN. My view is that the UN has turned into a quango of a sort. It is now a lot of corruption at a lot of levels, and we have invested a lot of time in it. And I'm wondering, should we begin to focus closer to home in the things that we're already members of, like the EU? And with regard to Africa, Ireland has invested from the time of our priests and nuns bringing Christianity. But now we've invested a lot of our NGOs and government help and support. But most of the countries that we are investing time and energy in are dictatorships with no democracy, especially the way South Africa has gone. So should we be also refocusing a lot more of our energy in Asia and other parts that we may be able to make more progress? Thank you.
Sir? Yep.
Democracies like Israel. So, my name is Michael Higgins. I was working at the Irish Mission in New York during the campaign and also during when they're on the Security Council, and I've also worked at New York University's Centre on International Cooperation in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals. The first thing I have to say from the campaign was neutrality was actually essential I have absolute respect for NATO, but neutrality was actually, I saw that it was essential to getting elected, but much more than that, it was intrinsic to how potent, how influential we were at the United Nations. Small countries have to be able to appeal on a cross-regional level to have impact at the UN. And because Ireland had, because of neutrality, had a perception that it didn't have vested interests or hidden agendas, it meant that Ireland has been able to become a great bridge builder at the UN, like other countries like Liechtenstein and Costa Rica. During our campaign, we assured a lot of non-Western states that we would take a very independent line and not be pressured by the P3 or the Western permanent members. And when we were on the Council, the great successes we had at the Security Council were often because we were given the benefit of the doubt that we would that because of that long record of trust, we were given the benefit of the doubt, and because of that, a lot of great things got over the line. In particular, he's too bashful to mention it, but Shane Ryan was involved in a great diplomatic achievement where on Ethiopia, Ireland, the African Council members, and Latin America managed to come together and make an important statement at a crucial time. That just would not have happened if we were members of NATO. I've worked with many African communities, governments, and it's really hard to overestimate how disliked NATO is. Africa's indelible memory is of NATO in the 60s and 70s supporting the military dictatorship of Salazar to attempt to crush independence movements. It was a conflict in which thousands have died, and which the longest-serving NATO Secretary General termed as spilling blood for freedom. So that's, in contrast, Ireland has this great record in Africa in terms of our missionaries and our nurses, our doctors, and our teachers, our humanitarian workers, our development workers. And because of this, we were given the great accolade, for example, of getting to draft the Sustainable Development Goals, which is probably the most single important international agreement in the last 10 years. And this Sustainable Development Goals are the Agenda 2030. It's alongside the other UN agenda items like our common agenda, the Sustainable Peace Agenda, the new Agenda to Peace. They basically form a kind of roadmap for how countries can work together and make progress. And the common binding thread of all of these agendas is that the interlinkages between things like peace, security, development, humanitarian action, human rights, and climate are such that we really cannot ignore them and treat them in isolation. We really need to work on them in concert. And it's a little bit, I suppose, disappointing so far that I haven't seen in this forum that what the documents which should really be the most salient and relevant documents for this discussion, they don't seem to have been discussed very much. And just one other small point is that we're having, it's great that we have these public debates, but it's much better when they're not, but it's much better when they're not, don't take place in a kind of a fractious or distrustful environment. And because of that, I think the very conspicuous and glaring omission of peace from this forum and the kind of alarmist tone of the material associated with it, I think has been unhelpful. Would it not have been much better to strike a tone of reassurance, of centurion calm? You know, the reality is that Ireland is still one of the least threatened countries in the world. We are held in high regard internationally, and our existing membership of the United Nations and the European Union means that we have even if any one of these hypothetical threats mentioned should happen, we have a wide array of options available to us in how we address them. And just to conclude, Ireland's future security, as in the past, is much better served by phone calls rather than fighter jets. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm also going to ask the panel to consider Donna O'Shea's question. The World Economic Forum has highlighted climate change and cybersecurity as the highest risks facing our societies. How does the UN Security Council deal with the challenge of cybersecurity as a mechanism of impacting peace and security? So across a very wide range of issues there. Renata, I'm going to go to you.
I mean, maybe, look, Mike, I'm not saying that neutrality isn't at the heart and enables your independence. I'm just trying to be factual for how you campaigned. And you campaigned on independence, and you campaigned on empathy, and you campaigned on partnership and commitment, and people heard those. And
please let her speak. Please let her speak.
And can I also just flag in general as a...
It needs to be.
Can I just flag that I think sometimes the centrality of neutrality for us, Irish people, is not necessarily seen as central and as critical viewed from outside. Outside view us by our actions. Are we pro-human rights? Do we support voices? Where are we consistent? And neutrality may enable those. But I think I want to just reflect on how the world sees us.
Please don't interrupt the panelists speaking.
And then I think I'll just touch briefly the questions on SDG, because I think you're right, Michael, that the Sustainable Development Goals was the high point in 2016 of an arrangement, of a commitment to sustainable development and in its widest possible sense. Since then, though, we've had climate, we've had COVID, and we've had a return, we've had a drop in progress out of extreme poverty. We have more countries falling back now into extreme poverty than we had before in the engagement. I think that what we're seeing is a question as to how do we revive those sustainable goals, and what is the role of Ireland in trying to get that role back on again, because the developing countries have lost faith in institutions like the UN, they've lost faith in institutions like the development framework, in what we can give and to offer. So I think there is some all to play for. And this September will be a summit on the SDGs. And the question is, can they get back on track? And is Ireland and other countries willing to help them? On the question of Africa and whether we should be engaged, I mean, I'm not going to get engaged in this, but I would say one of the things that I've welcomed in Ireland's support as a developing country or as a development actor is that it doesn't make its aid conditional always on good behaviour. There's a debate now in Finland, there's a debate now in Sweden that says, if you don't support us on Ukraine, we're cutting aid. And I don't myself think that's a moral and ethical place to be. And so I think when you need to think about development needs, it's about where are the needs of the greatest and where are the civilians in most great. And in my view, the needs of the civilians are often greatest in the spaces where their governments are the least effective and least commitment and least democratic. And if we walk away from those people, where do they get aid? Where do they get help? Because they're not getting it from their countries. And then just on cybersecurity, I do agree with the question that cybersecurity is critical, and I think it's been really hard for the Council to address this. Estonia has tried, as a small state, to bring it onto the agenda. Indonesia has tried to bring it onto the agenda. There's been a lot of meetings around it, but the Council has struggled. Why? Well, the P5 isn't super happy to discuss it, and Russia is certainly actively blocking it. But right now, next week, there will be an attempt to have a discussion on artificial intelligence, and I don't think it's going to be possible for the Council to keep blocking the discussion of technology and what that means for humankind for too long.
Shane, can I ask you also just on the cybersecurity issue? What did we see during the council or during our council tenure? My memory was that there was very little. Yeah. Estonia tried to bring it as an issue, but talk to me.
That was it. I think it's one of those difficult issues. I can maybe just touch on some of the other things as well. I mean, it was Estonia who made the biggest attempt. They made attempt across the board to look at digital issues, cyber issues. They saw it as a threat, and I suppose they raised it very early on, but very, very difficult. I think they tried for a presidential statement of the of the Council, and unfortunately that wasn't possible. Those kind of statements, which is a tool of the Council to really get our voice out there, that requires unanimity, and that wasn't possible, so we weren't able to get anything through on cybersecurity. I would just say on the climate and security, climate question, I mean, it's been mostly answered because we're going to continue in the General Assembly working with all of the countries that are on the group of friends of climate and security, looking for avenues. We'll try and find champions on the Council as the years go on, and they will probably be elected members, and I think that opening will come. But as well as that, dealing with climate change at the UN will be done through the Sustainable Development Goals. Ireland is leading the efforts at the moment on the kind of trying to renew faith in the Sustainable Development Goals, and we'll have an opportunity in September to look at that. Just on the question of neutrality as part of the campaign, I would say absolutely it was part of our campaign. It was one factor among many. Our EU membership, our engagement and our history in Africa, our commitment to women's rights, our commitment to human rights, all of these things together were very important in terms of.
So I'm going to pull this to a close now. Thank you very much. I know many people wanted to take the floor, but it's difficult to try and pull out everybody. So yes, I can't do that. I'm going to close the session now. I'm going to close the session now.
Children for 35 years of my life.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for listening. Thank you very much to the panellists. We're going to have a coffee break now, and we will resume in about 20 minutes. And I would really, really urge people to be respectful and listen.
And the grandchildren.
Folks, are we ready to start? If you can take your seats.
Okay, I think we have most of the people in the room. So I just want to, I'll hand over to the chair now to take over the second panel. What I will say is that we want to have a respectful debate here, and you know, I know everybody wants to get in and to have their say, but look, we have to, the chair is the moderator and she will ask for people from the floor to contribute. We can't have any personal attacks. You know, people have given up their time to come here and do that, so I would ask you to not engage in that at all. And I'd ask, and you know, if there are objections that do that, we may have to ask you to leave, which is not what we want here. So I would ask you to, thank you. So let's be respectful. There'll be plenty of time for people from the floor to contribute, and I'll hand over now to Renata. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone. It's great to be here for this session because it's at the heart of some of the discussions around Ireland's security needs, Ireland's security choices, Ireland's security objectives. I'm not going to spend too much long on the introductions, but let me just start by saying UN peacekeeping is a subject close to my heart, so I'm not going to pretend to be totally impartial on this one. I'm a fan of it. I'm committed to it. And I think that it has been around since the 1940s, and Ireland has been a member, an unbroken, continuous commitment to UN peacekeeping since 1958. Few other countries can claim that record. Ireland is currently about the 39th member of the total troop contributing countries in the world, and it is deployed in 4 to 5 UN missions around the world. So we're not going to have a long discussion today about what the UN peacekeeping has been like or what has Ireland been doing. We're going to try to be current and future focused. So we're just going to set the scene with a little bit of what is peacekeeping like today, because I think it's important that we all are aware of the reality of UN peacekeeping today, the opportunities, the challenges, the risks. And so a little bit of that. We're going to speak a little bit about the Council and its role and some of the dynamics there. And then we're going to move to talk about the triple lock. Its pros, its cons, options around it, how to make it work better, how to think about alternatives if that's necessary. So that's the phasing of the questions. So we're going to talk for half the session, and then there's going to be questions and answers. And like before, I'll take some on Slido and I'll take some from the audience here. The Slido is not just because of voting, it's so that people who are watching online can participate. So if that sounds good to you, I'm going to introduce briefly everyone that's here on the session today. My name's Renata Dwan. I'm currently based in Chatham House, currently living in India, and I'm from Athlone originally. Beside us, we have Major General Kieran Brennan. We were promised generals for this panel, so there you go. Major General Brennan retired from the Irish Defence Forces, who has an experience in peacekeeping missions, but also managing them from Dublin. Delighted to have and welcome to a lively debate in Ireland, Shamala Candia-Thompson, who is COO of the Security Council report, and that is an independent, impartial, neutral research institute that reports on the Security Council and its dynamics. But in an earlier life, Shamala was a Singaporean diplomat, so she has practitioner and policy experience. Beside her, we have Ray Murphy, professor from here in Galway, the Irish Centre for Human Rights. Ray is not only a former military, but a former barrister and a human rights expert. So he can really help us think through the international law, human rights dimensions of peacekeeping. And then last by no means least, Declan Power, also a former Irish peacekeeper and military officer, who is an independent defence analyst. So we're going to start the questions off, and we don't give speeches because speeches are preaching. We're actually trying to have a conversation, and then we're going to open it up to all of you. So welcome to everyone. I'm going to get the ball rolling today a little bit, and Ray, with you. There's this idea, partly because all of us in Ireland know UNIFIL very well, those of us from Athlone certainly do, and UNSOF and UNDOF, the old-style military ceasefire missions, where you stand between two states and you observe a ceasefire arrangement, or if you're lucky, a peace agreement, and you try to make sure that the peace is maintained between those two countries. That isn't how most of peacekeeping looks today for the UN. The bulk of UN peacekeepers are based in Africa, and they're based in large missions dealing with very complex situations. So tell us a little bit, describe some of the issues and some of the challenges of UN peacekeeping today and what the priorities are.
Yeah, I suppose, like you say, although Ireland is more recently associated with Lebanon and primarily the Golan Heights, there's a whole range of peacekeeping missions taking place around the world. Actually, many of them are not UN at all. But in a sense, I'm going to talk a little bit just about the Democratic Republic of the Congo for a short period, simply because it just captures some of the complexity of contemporary peacekeeping and some of the issues that have arisen. And prior to the war in Ukraine, some of the issues that have arisen over the Congo have caused difficulties between Russia, China, and the other members of the Security Council. And today, I mean, peacekeepers are sustaining incredible levels of casualties in places like Mali and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So you have a situation where they're ostensibly peacekeepers, but there isn't a peace to keep. That's nothing new to the situation of peacekeeping. It's just that it's got more serious and more challenging. As a consequence, in more recent times, drawing on experience in places like the former Yugoslavia, peacekeeping operations have become more robust, is the generic term used, where they're willing to use force and they're authorized to use force to ensure that the mandate is abided by. And central to the mandate in all contemporary peacekeeping operations is, in fact, the protection of civilians. Also central to the mandate is human rights and making a humanitarian space for humanitarian aid. Interestingly enough, the two countries that are most opposed to a strong human rights mandate for peacekeepers are China and Russia, and that's been contentious for some time. But it is challenging to send UN peacekeepers to a country like the Congo and then give them a mandate, giving them the right to use force to engage in hostile activities, almost like a combat operation, in order to carry out the mandate. That itself is very controversial, and it's something that we need to ponder as a nation in terms of our contribution to peacekeeping. And most of the situations that peacekeepers go to now are civil wars, which are always incredibly complex, and therefore deciding who are the good guys and who are the bad guys is contentious. And the peacekeeping mandate in the Congo, for example, has a role to support the Congolese forces, but actually the Congolese forces themselves are the perpetrators of major human rights abuses, putting the peacekeepers in an incredibly difficult position. Also linked to this to the Congo is the regionalization of peacekeeping. It's no longer just the UN mandating a particular force, but it often delegates to regional organizations, and often regional organizations can be better than an international group of states, including Ireland, to deal with a particular situation. But that's fraught with its own difficulties. And I'll just give one remark. If you're dealing with West Africa, and then you have the West African states, and you might think, okay, so Nigeria is the most powerful state in that region, it can solve the problems of West Africa, but no, that wouldn't be how the Ghanaians and other West Africans would see it. So that itself is complex. And of course, we're all aware of the fact that there's major tensions now in the Security Council over Ukraine, over a range of things. Ukraine only has brought these things to a particular boiling point. These were simmering for a long period of time, making finding agreement for peacekeeping extremely difficult. So therefore, in the field, there are real challenges, like the Malian government has just told the peacekeepers to leave. And that reflects geopolitical tensions, the fact that the Malians weren't happy with the fact, for example, this happened in the Congo also, that sometimes the UN calls out the national government for its violations against its own civilian population. So the environments in which peacekeepers are trying to operate are extremely challenging and complex. And that is actually universal. And maybe that sets the scene.
No, that's great, Ray. Thank you for that. And thanks for bringing out that the tensions aren't only top-down from the Council, but they are that bottom-up pressure. And just on the Mali, having worked on that mission, you know, the UN has found itself in a terrible position of defending a coup regime, working alongside a military coup, and then being kicked out now because of having a human rights component in its mission. So that challenge is complex. I'm going to ask Kieran just one question on how does Ireland at headquarters help support its troops in for these kinds of contexts and these situations?
Well, essentially, just to be clear on this, the whole issue in relation to how it manages, there's a political dimension and an operational dimension to peacekeeping operations. Obviously, the political decision makers make their decisions and endorsed by government, and then the operational aspect of the mission then is operationalised by Defence Force Headquarters. For me, as the director, as the Deputy Chief of Staff Operations, I had responsibility for delivering those operational outputs on the ground, ensuring that all of the various enablers to ensure success as far as we could from an Irish perspective were in place. That meant that that we had a fourth generation practice that ensured that we had our troops prepared, trained and ready and equipped to go to these areas. We also ensured that they were trained to deal with the specific and potential issues that they would meet in those areas, whether it was in Lebanon, whether it was on the Golan. And back in my own day, before when I commanded a battalion in Chad, we were very specific in relation to the training. And then once the mission is deployed overseas, let me tell you that as the Deputy Chief of Staff Operation, it was always my #1 priority, the safety and security of our troops overseas. And how that was achieved was in collaboration with stakeholders in the Department of Defence and ourselves to ensure that the best possible equipment was provided to our peacekeepers, to provide them with force protection assets, with intelligence gathering assets, and with all of the means available to them to allow them to accomplish their mission. And in the main, that was successful. We would have met some hiccups on the way, and indeed we may talk later, Renata, about the difference between, for example, working within the UN system and in regional organisations which have an experience of both, because there is a marked difference. But overall, my main effort and those of my colleagues working in the arena was to ensure that our peacekeepers were fully equipped, fully trained and prepared to meet any eventuality when they went to the mission area.
Yeah, and one of the dominant themes of discussions inside the UN in recent years, and including on the Security Council, has been not only just do our troops have what they need, the protection, the safety, the security arrangements, but how can we help troop contributing countries from poorer situations to have capabilities. Declan, has the Irish Army or the Irish government been involved in supporting any of those efforts?
Yes, we have, both at an organisational level, things like the European Union training missions, which are UN authorised. So I first would have come across the EU training mission for Somalia that General McBeery, who I think is here today, was in command of. And I think after that, General Ahern took over. And that was pivotal to try and give the Somalians their own organised regular army. And the EU training mission, they were training them how to be soldiers, but they were training those who were identified as having leadership material to be the new officer corps, training medics, military police, to give them the panoply of things you need in a properly constituted military force that is mandated by its government to do what it does. You had the EU training mission in Mali as well. So those are things that I think the EU was able to allow us participate in and make a contribution. Within, if it was directly under the UN, there wouldn't be quite as much of that nature. However, I myself, when I was serving as a SIM Corps officer in different parts of Africa, was involved in the training and mentoring of junior officers, senior NCOs and middle-ranking officers from emerging African nations that were going to take leadership roles. And this is crucial stuff, because these African forces, these, if I can use that a kind of a slightly colloquial term, these African boots on the ground, they were the ones at the coal face of very fractious, difficult, messy situations. And they didn't really have much training, bar the basic military training. And in that situation, when things get out of hand, when you go, as a US Marine Corps general talked about, the 3-block war, when you go from peacekeeping to humanitarian support to war fighting, maybe all in the one day, that's when human rights abuses can take place, if troops aren't properly led, if the troops on the ground don't have confidence in their sergeants and officers. And that's where the kind of training I was doing came in, trying to embed human rights awareness, humanitarian support awareness into the combat leaders, because it's not enough to do it with a whiteboard and a chart. You've got to get out there, get your boots dirty, and hold their hands when the going gets tough. And the training we did in Mali and the training that we supplied to the Somalians in Uganda made a difference, saved lives and prevented abuses. And it's that synergy of things, I thought. That was the personal takeaway I took from that. And our adaptability and making those different arrangements work. And I came away with one abiding opinion. We should not box ourselves into corners to keep anyone happy. We should retain the right to independence in course of action, whether it's with our own national security or if it's with our contributions abroad. And we should also bear in mind that if we want to make a difference on the ground, out there where it's dirty and dangerous and bloody and you get your boots dirty, you need the right vehicles to get there. Right. Standing on the sidelines
Declan,
doesn't cut it.
I'm going to take you back here just a minute because I want to bring in Shamala. Shamala, you've heard from the men, but tell us about what's happening now in the Security Council. And we've heard a lot about Russia, we've heard a lot about China, but what's the reality of UN peacekeeping missions mandating renewal oversight?
Sure. I mean, we've heard this morning and yesterday, I believe, how difficult the environment is. And it's also been pointed out that it's not just 2022. This has been something that we've seen. I would say it started getting difficult from about 2011. We saw the Libya-Syria situations coming in, so the dynamic over that has affected the ability to make certain types of decisions. It hasn't, the Council's not paralyzed. There's sometimes an outside perception that it is, especially after February 2022, but it has continued to adopt resolutions on peacekeeping mandate renewals. But everything is more difficult. And, as we've heard this morning, the Council has also been criticized, possibly for not really doing its job in terms of maintenance of international peace and security. But the dynamics has affected, I think, the type of resolutions you can have on peacekeeping mandates. We've seen that there's a tendency to do what we call technical rollovers, so shorter term, where there's no change in the mandate. Although the situation on the ground has changed, they need time to catch up. And that sort of also, could be a problem on the ground. Are they being given mandates that allow them to do the job? So that's one. Another point with the difficult dynamics is how it's become more difficult to bring new issues to the Council. We heard in the first panel, sort of Ireland and how it took on trying to bring Tigray into the Security Council's discussions. That was really hard. But it's not the only issue. There are other issues that are being blocked by friends on the Council who do not, sort of want to have those discussions, or those countries don't want to be discussed. Generally, countries don't want to be on the Security Council's agenda. They fight against that very hard. Now and then you have a country like Colombia coming and saying, we would like you to help us, sort of we have a peace agreement. So that's been more difficult. And I think adopting sort of good peacekeeping mandates when they renew them, we haven't got to talking about new peacekeeping missions, but even that's more difficult. Issues around human rights, women, peace and security, climate, all of those come into the negotiations and the discussions. And there's a fight not to have that in. So I think there's a question about what that means in terms of the type of mandates you might be able to have as well.
So as Ray described it, after decades of expanding the mandates to really try to look at the causes of conflict, the structural drivers of conflict, whether that's climate impact, whether that's injustice, whether that's proper functioning state institutions. We're seeing a rowing back from that. We're seeing the Security Council wanting to narrow that. And that's what we saw in Mali, where effectively China and Russia pushed back on a human rights mandate within the peacekeeping mission. And that, in a way, enables the country in question then to challenge the human rights and feels enabled and empowered to do that. I'm going to move us straight on to the triple lock because I want us to have sufficient time for discussion on that. And it's used a lot, and it's the triple lock. You might all think you know what that means, but I think it would be helpful if we could just have a little few minutes. Ray, would you mind just walking us through what is the triple lock? And if somebody wants to join in on it too, but just the very basics of what it means. Yeah, well, Shamala, you can hear it too if you're not familiar with it.
Yeah, well, just the basic background. This was a commitment made by the government about 20 years ago in order to, when Ireland voted against, it was the Nice referendum, and it was to reassure people that we weren't, as a country, going to engage too greatly in perceived EU militarisation. And essentially, it says that before we can send troops abroad in a UN peacekeeping role or peacekeeping role, it must have the Dáil, government and Dáil approval, which of course is pretty straightforward, but that it must be subsequent to a UN mandate. And that can be either by the Security Council or the General Assembly. So to be a UN peacekeeping operation, for Ireland to participate, there must be approval from one of either of the two major organs, the Security Council or General Assembly, in order to permit us to participate. The problem that some people see with that is that if one of the members of the Security Council decides that they're, for whatever reason, and China did this back in about 2002 or 2003, which was a petty, vindictive decision by the Chinese, it vetoed the UN approval for a very small peacekeeping operation in a tiny state, Macedonia. And so therefore it didn't have UN approval, and because of that, Ireland could not participate. Okay, so the UN approval is the essence of the triple lock.
And I'm just going to ask Shamala, just to help us before we get into the discussion, tell us about, at the moment, how does UN partnership work? So UN Security Council is authorising a range of regional actors, and how is there support for that? How does that work?
Sure. So there are two types of resolutions that the Council could pass in relation to peace operations. One is where it is a UN peacekeeping or political mission. And then the other is connected to when a regional organization comes in. We saw that in Somalia, for example. And there, what it does, it has an oversight role. It authorizes it, but the troops are being provided by regional forces. We see that in Bosnia as well. They have to adopt a resolution reauthorizing. And this is where I think I'm not an Irish citizen, so I'm not going to weigh in on the triple lock right now. But I do think that in relation to this discussion, what might be happening with UN peacekeeping and the idea of more regionalization or the regional forces coming in, and the type of role the Security Council play. You pointed out earlier under Chapter 8, there is a role, and I think that is very clear. And the question would be, how will that role be played out if we see this happening more and more? What we're seeing is these large UN peacekeeping operations are being pushed out. One point that I'd like to make is that the host governments in some of these places, Mali's one, but also we see it in Sudan now, in Central African Republic. They don't want the big UN forces. So what's the alternative? Because these are not situations that are stable yet. So many of the missions are going through a review. They're heading towards transitions. Something Ireland did when it was on the Council, I think was an important resolution on transitions, because this is something that the Council is going to have to pay a lot of attention to in the coming years.
So this question, and I think of more regional types of peacekeeping missions, we're seeing it most in Africa. And I think it's we're also seeing situations where African regional entities are launching operations without UN authorization or even a African Union authorization. There's 2 missions right now, one in northern Mozambique, launched by the South African Development Cooperation, and one in eastern Congo, which has been launched by a sub-regional cooperation, neither of which got AU authorization or got UN authorization before. They subsequently now are coming to the African Union, in part for financing reasons. But it's about the oversight, you're saying, it's about the benefits. Kieran, I'm going to come to you. What are the benefits of the triple lock? I mean, Ray explained why it came about, but let's have a discussion about the strengths of it, what it gives us.
Well, first of all, could I say that I would have served all my missions overseas under the auspices of the United Nations, where a United Nations Security Council resolution was present during all those missions, whether it was Lebanon, whether it was in Kosovo, or whether it was in Chad. And I was always very proud of the fact that I got to wear the blue beret of the United Nations. That was a great source of pride for me, and continues to be so as the Honorary President of the United Nations Veterans Association. So I want to put that on the table, first of all. For me as a commander, for example, in Chad, which is a United Nations Security Council resolution, I always believed that it gave great credibility to the mission on the ground. I recollect on the many occasions when we got visitors into Gosbida, into Camp Kira, when we were briefing our visitors, the first slide that would always go up on the board would be the United Nations Security Council resolution. And that was the starting point for our briefing. And from that fell out of that resolution our mission statement and our operational plans and our delivery of operational outputs. So for me, it lent great credibility to the force on the ground. You were flying the flag on behalf of the United Nations. And when you were operating in an austere environment like we were in Chad, for example, and I'm using Chad as a personal example, and I know we have some distinguished members of the audience here who served there, it was a great comfort to know that you were there in concert with other organisations from the United Nations, like the World Food Programme, for example, assisting the local population in delivering not just food, but security to the many people who needed it there. So that would, for me, Renetta, would have been the biggest single thing about the resolution, that you had the support of the international community, you had credibility on the ground, and even though we were an Irish unit, not wearing blue berets in Chad or indeed Kosovo, we had that credibility on the ground.
So the legitimacy that the triple lock gives you, and the
legitimacy of the UN, the Security Council at that particular juncture, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Ray, do you want to add anything in there?
Yeah, you've added the word that Kieran, it was the legitimacy that I consider really important, and I accept everything else that Kieran says. I mean, like the Tánaiste said this morning, we're committed to multilateralism. The essence of multilateralism is the United Nations. If we act outside the framework of the United Nations, then we're weakening the very organisation that we're committed to, we say that we're trying to strengthen. And to me, it's really important that it's difficult to work, because Ed mentioned this morning the former Yugoslavia, and that's where there is a problem and there's a European force, and if we don't have a UN mandate, a UN approval for that, what do we do? Well, there was an old adage when I was a law student: hard cases make bad law. If you're confronted with a set of difficult circumstances, you can't start bending the law or changing it to try to come up with what you think is a good solution. The framework for this is the United Nations Charter. We are a nation committed to disarmament, multilateralism, and to strengthening and working within that framework. That's what we were renowned for. That's what we were successful for in the Security Council. Why would we do something which is counterproductive to this, that weakens that framework and acts outside it? So I think that would damage our long-term reputation, and I don't think it's a legitimate thing to do, even if it's even if it's not a violation of international law as such, because a host state can ask. Yeah. It is the right of a host state to ask another power to come in and assist it, but I don't think we should ever support something outside of the framework of the UN. And just one final point, and I know it's not simple, this, but everyone is talking about the Security Council can stop it, but actually there is another mechanism within the General Assembly.
I'm glad you brought that up.
It can be referred to the General Assembly. It's not straightforward, it's not simple. You need a 2/3 majority, you need the support of the majority of the Security Council, but that has worked before. It will take a lot of work and effort, but the General Assembly is a much more representative, legitimate organ within the United Nations. The Security Council does not represent humankind or all states. It favours the small few.
So thanks for bringing us in that, and thanks for reminding us. It is Security Council that authorises, but it is possible for the General Assembly to authorise an operation. Shamala, do you want to have a two-finger?
Yeah, maybe just before that, to touch on the use of the veto and peacekeeping missions. It's rare for the veto to be used to shut down a mission. You mentioned Macedonia, that was one example. And the other recent, in my recent memory, is Georgia, where Russia vetoed a resolution. UNAMIC was the operation there. And I think what we have seen in the last couple of years, not just last year, is the threat of the veto and how that is being used by some permanent members. But I mean, at least from our observation of the council, I actually don't think any council member, any permanent member wants to shut down a mission. It's a very big deal to do that. But I think they can get certain things by that threat of a veto. We saw that, I think, with Bosnia. There was an abstention where Russia did not vote for it, but they didn't veto it. So I think that we'll see. I mean, we're living in unusual times, so we'll see what happens. But I think it takes a lot to veto a mission that's there. The flip side is, why have there been no new missions since 2014? And that's another question. Again, I'm not convinced it's because there's a fear of a veto. There are a lot of other reasons why issues have not come into the council. You need to have it on its formal agenda before you could set up the mission. But there are some that come to mind. Could you have had something on Tigray, sort of, looking after the peace agreement? On Ukraine, obviously, there's been talk about, in the last year, should there have been some kind of mission set up? So we're not yet at the point where, even a veto is being considered, because it's not in that level of discussion. With the General Assembly, it would not be easy. It would take a lot, but it's possible. It has been a very long time since the General Assembly did have, sort of authorized a mission. There's been talk about it because of what happened with Ukraine. I think a situation where you have a permanent member of the council involved in a conflict is a very difficult thing for the Security Council to deal with, and this is why the General Assembly is getting more involved.
I'd love us at some stage to come back to the question of some of the challenges facing peacekeeping, as you said, over and above the veto, as to why we're not getting new peacekeeping. We're not getting countries asking for it, and we're not getting countries willing to contribute to it. And we need to think about that and what that means if it is the central linchpin of Ireland's foreign presence and security policy engagement overseas. But in fairness, I want to reflect all views. So, Declan, what are the cons of the triple lock as you see it?
Well, as an Irish citizen, I can't stand over the idea that we would abrogate our responsibilities to a foreign power. And that's what the triple lock is doing, make no mistake about it. We're living in very strange times, very fluid times, and we're letting, with regards to our peacekeeping, we're giving the opportunity to totalitarian states to not influence, but to dictate what we do and where we go. That does not sit well with me. And aside from the fact then, let's take it from the strategic level down a little bit. Operationally, I served with the UN mission in Darfur some years ago, at the same time as the EU mission was being deployed across the border in Chad. And a number of fellow troop contributing nations were, and indeed local Sudanese who were operating in different aid agencies, were asking why could this EU mission not be deployed in Darfur. And then in the discussion about that as well, at another stage in South Sudan, the question came up, if Ireland was involved, were they going to be a reliable partner? Because with the triple lock, those that were aware of it, could they be delayed in deploying? Or worse again, if deployed, if there was a delay in the resolution being maintained, could they be pulled out? I didn't have any answer for that. And I don't think anybody does have an answer for that. And that's why we really need to give it some thought. I don't pretend to have all the answers here, but I do pay attention to a lot of our partner nations, all of whom particularly in the European Union, all of whom look to the UN for the legal and moral guidance, but they're not bound by having to wait for a resolution. And I'm also minded to think at this time about the genocide in Rwanda. And if the international community had been able to move a bit more quickly, sometimes you have to, there was an officer I served under once said, move now, paperwork to follow. And sometimes you do have to hit the ground running. And Kofi Annan himself said in 1996, Kofi Annan, former General Secretary of the UN, he wished there were more regional organizations, such as the AU, such as NATO, that they could subcontract out missions because the command and control was in place and they could get on the ground. So Ireland is restricting itself, as far as I see it, in the kinds of contributions it can make because of the triple lock. And the other point I want to make here, particularly for those of you who might have some experience in the field in international relations, be it military or within aid work, there is a notion at play here that it's the UN overall that's good. And my experience on the ground tells me that not everybody sees it that way. I've been on a lot of UN missions, and I've been on EU-related and NATO-related missions, all with the UN mandate. And in some cases, the UN were not wanted. It was the EU mission that was wanted because people could see it being more cohesive. They wanted to see European boots on the ground for this particular situation. They didn't trust some of the African troop contributing countries for a variety of historical reasons, which I could understand. And also, the humanitarian community, they don't see UN troops as partial because they're there as part of a UN resolution. And we have to understand this. The UN resolution means when you are part of a UN mission, you're not neutral. If you're with a UN agency like UNICEF or OCHA or something like that, you're not bound by the resolution. You're not bound by the SOFA, the Status of Forces Agreement. So the players in the conflict oftentimes will see the UN force as being partial because they're there to uphold. The Congo is a really good example. There's a full-on shooting war. A UN force, blue helmets, and they've got tanks, artillery, special forces. Ireland has never participated in that. No EU force that I'm aware of has been in that kind of an operation. So what I'm just trying to inject here is a little bit of awareness. It's not binary.
No, clearly it isn't. But just before you come back to that, you want that choice. Tell us which missions at the moment of NATO or EU are not authorised by the UN.
Off the top of my head, I can't think of any.
Right, so every NATO and EU mission at the moment has a UN mandate.
The only one thing I would say is that there were missions where sometimes troops were deployed and the paperwork in the resolution got authorised sometime afterwards. And that's where I think there's a practical problem. If Ireland's contribution is stymied because of that practical problem, that's at the operational level. At the more conceptual level, at the citizen level, really, abrogating our responsibilities.
Well, if I can, Declan, you've made that point. Okay. I want us to keep us thinking about the world of peacekeeping as it is today, because I think the UN peacekeeping, I think it's important that when we have that debate, it's grounded in truth and fact as to where are we right now. And I would like us just also to touch base briefly on, before we open for questions, on the types of NATO, EU and UN operations. But you, your hand first, Kieran, and then Ray.
Well, notwithstanding what I was talking about, the legitimacy of the process of engaging, I do believe that the security dynamic has changed. And there are situations where in the future, the Irish government, and we're a values-based society where a humanitarian crisis might erupt and it might be necessary for the Irish government to intervene. I just want to give you a possible scenario. 12 months from now, we don't know what the secure environment is going to be. There could be a massive humanitarian crisis in the Balkans, for example. We are providing 182 troops to a German battle group next year that will be on standby for 1 year. A force protection company, a national support element, and indeed members of the actual headquarters. And if the EU want to use that instrument to combat a severe humanitarian crisis where men and women, and we've already heard about women and children particularly, suffer inordinately during war, and we have a situation where the EU want to use that instrument to intervene in that humanitarian crisis, we cannot do so without a UN Council resolution. So notwithstanding what I said about the legitimacy of the process, I do believe we're now in a different space, and we should be mature enough to be able to reflect on that and be able to decide, yes, we need to intervene on humanitarian grounds.
Thanks, Kieran. Ray?
Yeah, I just want to make another point about Darfur, and while I agree with much of what's been said by my colleagues, after Darfur there was a lot of soul searching undertaken, and there was a study done and a doctrine developed called the responsibility to protect. And I mean, I'm not going to bore everybody with the details, but in the end, in 2005, having considered all those issues, the World Summit, which was pretty representative and legitimate, supported this doctrine, but said that any response must be within the framework of the United Nations. Again, emphasizing the importance of multilateralism. That does not, I'm not opposed to, I think the EU did a very constructive and important role prior to the UN mission in Chad. And I don't oppose the EU deploying a peacekeeping force on the basis as a bridging mechanism prior to a full international UN force. It's just that frankly, I would be very deeply suspicious of any of the permanent members of the Security Council and their own agendas, and using those to further their own foreign policy pursuits. And outside of the framework of the UN, that's much easier to do. You can do it within the framework also, unfortunately. I think this is the only way to retain legitimacy and long-term sustainability for such operations.
And I think just to clarify what Ray was saying when he talked about responsibility to protect, that is the doctrine that in the face of massive atrocities or violations of human rights on a massive scale, there is an imperative. You are required as a state to try to engage and support, but it's through the practice of the UN. I also want to just to reflect on the nature of the UN and the EU, because sometimes the debate is a bit, the UN does the nice stuff, the nice missions in along borders where there's a peace agreement, and the EU and the NATO do what we call the pointy end of the stick, the more intense, the more violent, the more aggressive operations. But that's not actually the case in practice. Shamala, at the moment you talked about the 4 main missions of the UN. They're in large, difficult spaces with all of them with a mandate to use force for protection of civilians and in some cases to support the state.
No, I think they are in very difficult situations. And when you go back, the UN Charter does not include the word peacekeeping. And when you look at sort of where it might come to a child, Dag Hammarskjöld quite famously said that it was chapter 6.5, so it's between chapter 6 and chapter 7, because the early peacekeeping, there wasn't the idea of the use of force. But today, because of the type of situations that they are in, there's had to be a Chapter 7 use of force type of mandate. So
and in fact, what we see in most of the EU missions today, more training, more advisory, more border management, more smaller type operations. So it's the UN that's doing the pointy end of the stick, and the EU and NATO doing more supporting state institutions. I'm conscious that people now have been waiting and would like to ask questions. So I'll ask you, I'm going to take a couple from the floor, and then I'm going to take a couple from the people watching online. And I'll take 3 at a time so that we can try to group them, and ask you to keep your questions short if you can. The lady here, I'm afraid I don't know your name, excuse me.
Ray the Crown. So, hi, Renata. I'm Ray the Crown and Sinn Féin TD for North Kildare and junior spokesperson on defence. I'd like to ask, you made a reference there to the Macedonia in 1995. That was actually before the Nice Treaty, before the triple lock came into being in Ireland. And I just would like to ask the panel, because we've asked this question a few times, what missions did Ireland want to join that they were precluded to joining because of the triple lock? And references have been made that there have been vetoes, but they were never on actual peacekeeping missions. Plus, and I know we have 3 members of the Defence Forces, and I'd like to thank you for your service as well to your country. But what implications do you believe that that might have for a mission that Irish members of the Defence Forces would be going out to without that UN mandate, without that UN approval?
Can I ask you just to wrap, because I want to try to bring in lots of questions.
Yeah, and I just think that, you know, any discussion on the triple lock really, I believe trust is, you know, I think you can see the amount of emotion that this consultative, sorry, I have a right hand, has had, and I think the lack of trust, that really, without neutrality enshrined in the Constitution, I don't think we can go near the triple lock, and I think that the people really wouldn't trust the government without to get rid of the triple lock without that.
Thank you, Senator Patrick.
Thank you, Chair. First and foremost, I would ask the panel, do they think it's time that the people of Ireland had clearly explained to them the difference between the various chapters 6, 7 and 8, firstly? Secondly, what other country would hand its sovereignty over and allow, as my colleague Declan said a little while ago, allow somebody else to have a veto over whether we send our troops to a particular troubled area or not? And finally, if we are going to keep the triple lock, and I personally would be against it, why limit it to such a tiny force in a situation where we're trying to extract Irish citizens from troubled areas? Why don't we have 100 or 250 that can be sent, instead of sending a very small number and putting their lives at risk? Thank you.
Thank you, and I think that's a really important question that the Senator is asking. Also, even how do we even define peace support operations? Because if you define an extraction or support to you Irish citizens as a peace support operation, that's not how the UN would define it. We've got one question here, and then I'm going to go round to a second round in a moment. Oh, I'll take your next round.
Sorry, my name is retired Brigadier General Gerard Ahern, and I was fortunate enough to spend cumulatively 14 and a half years on missions with the United Nations, NATO, the European Union, and with OSCE. And I have a question which is in two parts, and if I may, Chair, just nest the question in a number of things.
As long as it's short.
It'll be very brief. Yesterday in Cork, the esteemed Professor Bridget Labadon, at the very start, when answering a question from the floor about Ireland diplomatically engaging with Russia, she said, "We're not players." It's on the record what she said yesterday. You know, and a couple of days ago, Fergus Finlay wrote an article as a Corkman, the only paper of note, the Examiner, when he said, and I quote, is that Ireland is one of the leading military neutral peacekeeping countries. Well, if you use the yardstick of Ireland as our neutrality being, you know, not members of military alliance, the leading peacekeeping countries that are neutral are India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Ghana, Sri Lanka, and most recently, Chad. That's the reality of it. Now, I would suggest to you that one of the problems, and it's been raised here by the panel, is that all mandates that result in peacekeeping operations are compromises. But having served as the deputy commander of those UN forces for 2 years in Chad, the most important document for me every day was, yes, the mandate, but more importantly, the document that flows from that into the operations, which is the military strategic concept of operations. And there were 17 taskings in that for the UN forces in Chad. 14 of the 17 were exclusively about delivering military outputs for the humanitarian community. The challenge in peacekeeping at the moment is that it's been in bother for a long time predating the challenge and the discussions about vetoes, right? And that the challenge that commanders have is that, unfortunately, the overwhelming majority of troops that are delivered to a commander in the field are not capable of the military outputs required for the military strategic concept of operations. That's the key challenge. In the 20 years between 2000 and 2020, the UN Security Council mandated 83, I say again, 83 Chapter 8 missions for a particular reason. It's far easier, in the main, to get troops that are capable of those operational outputs from regional organizations. My two questions. First of all, there needs to be a focus. Sorry, I was...
No, you were going to ask the question, sir.
Sorry, I am the question. And it's about midnight and 9/10 in Chad in March of 2009, when the UN took over from the European Union. And the greatest problem that we had immediately was the dysfunction between the accountancy process of the European Union, which is cost lie where it falls, and the reimbursement of the UN, and trying to take over EU equipment in a financial way that wasn't compatible. And secondly, none of this that we're talking about today, unless we can actually re-establish a defence forces in Ireland, and we need to have a conversation on why it is the defence forces and the Garda Síochána are having problems recruiting and retaining. It's in the ambition of the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform to have a one-size-fits-all public service, and it's not compatible with recruiting and retaining in uniform services. Thank you.
Okay, so that was more of a statement than a question, so I'll take one more question.
You asked me, how can we
yeah.
the future?
No, but great, they will come back to it, sir. They will come back to it. But I'm just going to get one more.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, or Chairperson. The triple lock, it was on the big screen in capitals. We seem to have meandered a bit away from yes or no. Now, the history of the triple lock was a very, what we call, it was a piece of legislation that was put through Dáil Éireann to get us, the citizen, to vote for the second time in favour of it. Now, that triple lock served no purpose other than that. We registered it, and it is obsolete since. And it has been thrown around here by every Tom, Dick and Harry of minority interests about whether we, as a neutral country, if we step away from it, can we trust the government? I heard a speaker saying, can we trust the elected government? Of course we can trust the elected government, because they do all the different things. We have checks and balances in our democracy. So the triple lock should be discontinued to allow the Irish armed forces, and as well as that, the Irish Oireachtas, to legislate and perform duties with NATO if they need to under mandates, or with EU mandates. The triple lock is obsolete. That's what I want to say, and we need to get rid of it, and we can get rid of it through the Oireachtas. It doesn't need any sort of a referendum. So if the Dáil votes through and the Shannon and the President signs it off, if he will.
Okay, thank you. I think we're going to go back to the panel, and then I'll come back to a second round.
In the discussion, we're getting none of the moment.
Right. Okay, thanks. Does anyone, Kieran, I'm going to start with you.
The first question that was asked by my colleague here in relation to, as far as I'm aware, there was only been one mission that the Irish Defence Force were precluded from participating in, was the Macedonia mission that was mentioned there, and that was because of a Chinese intervention. You also spoke about the safeguards in respect of maybe the European Union taking up the mantle of being the lead role in and what guarantees have you? I mean, any of the European Union CSDP missions are in accordance with international humanitarian and human rights law. They also have a gender perspective, and if you're familiar with the European institutions, they also have a very robust decision-making process, which ultimately mirrors what the UN do, culminating in a CONOPS, which the force commander then and in the operational commander in the case of Chad would deliver. So I would have no issues about the European Union taking up the mantle of running an overseas mission, dealing with a significant humanitarian crisis, such as I instanced there a few minutes ago, and doing it properly and in accordance with international and human rights law.
Just as I'd add just one factual point, which is the model of UN mission planning. It's called integrated mission, which means police, civilian and military all working together. That model is more or less adopted by the EU, and more or less the concept accepted by NATO, but in practice they don't have as much civilians in their missions. But that concept has been very similar, that doctrine and practice. Declan, did you want to answer something?
To address our colleague, and hello again, I heard you speak yesterday very eloquently about to address inequalities. And if you think about it, most of these missions are about trying to restore stability, equality and safety on the ground. And I understand the whole emotional connection to the triple lock, which is why this conversation is so important. One of the things, Renata, you mentioned it there, the whole thing of complex emergency training and awareness. I've been involved in training personnel on EU missions and NATO-led missions about that as well. So that's been adopted. And we sometimes forget that, and I'm a complete supporter of the UN, and I get the whole multilateral aspect, but we need other devices, because there are a question was asked earlier, some UN operations can be in danger of becoming supportive of questionable regimes. So we need to really be questioning UN missions, the application of the resolutions as well. Not just to kind of assume that once there's a resolution in place that our oversight stops. We need to be aware that just because it's a UN-led mission that it mightn't have problems. And the same with EU, the same with NATO-led missions. They're all should be under a UN mandate. Now, having said that, with regards to that, and just to bring it down, I've been on missions where I've seen, to refer to R2P, the responsibility to protect, that doctrine is in place, which facilitates something else called POCs, protection of civilian sites. So all the doctrine is in place, but on UN missions, that doesn't often percolate down to reality on the ground. When I was in South Sudan, the UN mission had a major screw-up. A lot of civilians got killed with an attack by an armed band on a protection of civilian site right beside a UN base near a place called Bor in South Sudan at the height of the civil war. There were, I think, 70-something civilians killed right under the nose. Excuse me, Ed. I've heard you talk about your service. Give me the grace and space to talk about mine. This is relevant to the discussion. The UN contingent, I won't name the country, but they were mandated to act, but they didn't act. And that was down to poor leadership, command and control. It was inexcusable. 70-odd souls were killed that didn't need to be killed because the peacekeepers didn't do what the Irish peacekeepers at Jadaville did, stand their ground and respond with lethal force when appropriate. That wouldn't have happened on an EU-led, or dare I say it, a NATO-led force with the UN mandate. And the reason I can say that with some authority is the one in Kosovo, I mentioned it yesterday, Irish troops under a UN-mandated NATO-led mission saved a large number of Kosovar Muslims from being massacred. So what I'm saying is we need to examine all missions. We need to call them out if they're not fit for purpose or they're supporting a questionable regime. And we need to be agile and mobile on it. And I don't know whether in the heel of the hunt whether you're going to retain the triple lock or not, but I'm largely with the gentleman there who spoke. I think it's obsolete. I think it was a short-term tool that isn't suitable. Maybe we need other tools and we should have that discussion. And I really welcome you for getting involved in it.
Okay, I'm going to want to give Ray a chance to come in here.
Yeah,
Ray.
okay. So Senator and Chocolate, you asked a lot of questions, so I'll just two things stood out to me. First is I think it's really important that in schools there's civic education about the UN Charter and peacekeeping and peace and all those things. I think that's where it begins. But you asked a far more technical question, and it's about the legal framework. What stopped us going to Macedonia? And I regret to say, actually, during the week, I was looking at the 2006 Defence Amendment Act, which is the act that governs our participation. And I have to ring a colleague who looks at this more often and say, look, I'm looking at this, and actually, I'm having difficulty understanding it. I'm supposed to be a law professor. So he said, yeah, the act is ambiguous. It's inadequate. It needs to be refined and changed and amended. We drafted that, and that's the legislative framework. But as I understand it, to go right back to 1960, which would have been the founding act, it restricted our participation to UN-approved operations by the Security Council of the General Assembly. So I'm assuming that was the basis that we made that decision. But right now, the triple lock, I believe, was a commitment made to the Irish people as part of the European integration process. To renege on that, I think that needs to be seriously considered. I think many people would consider that a betrayal of a promise that was made on the basis of European integration and supporting a particular EU treaty. But more importantly, the legislation permitting us to, for example, the defence forces got themselves into, and the government, into a completely artificial bind about giving security to the Tánaiste, or it might have been the Taoiseach, going to Ukraine, that they couldn't deploy because of restrictions. Now, the triple lock and the restrictions that we've put sometimes on deployment of small amounts of defence forces are not what I'm opposed to. I think the there should be provision for that, and for going to assist in humanitarian organisations. I mean, the most fundamental, we have to be careful about responding to crisis. The most fundamental change in defence legislation took place in the early 90s when we went to Somalia, and it was humanitarian organisations were pressing, and the law really radically changed. So even the 2006 Act, it was in response to certain public individuals and humanitarian organisations looking for a change. So I think the triple lock is the fundamental principle, but it's enshrined in our legislation. But it shouldn't preclude us from the flexibility to do other important short-term missions, which have nothing to do with peacekeeping as such.
Like evacuate our civilians,
yes,
protect our government leaders. Somebody's been waiting very patiently. We've 18 people in support of this question online, so I'm going to just ask that and then I'll open back out. So from Fionn Dempsey, some EU common security and defence policy missions involve training of African forces to police migration of Africans across Africans and to prevent them from reaching EU external borders. Is this peacekeeping or EU border policy, and why should Ireland be involved? Does anyone want to take that? Kieran, do you want to take that?
If I could just reflect on that question for a moment. I have experience, I've been to Mali, I've visited our troops on 2 separate occasions in Mali, and they're involved in the European Union training mission. Sadly, it seems we're now down to 8, and we may be, but my experience of what they were delivering out there was building capacity for the Chadian armed forces to deal with the difficulties and challenges that the Malian armed forces and indeed the UN forces were facing in the northern regions of Sahel around Kigali and Timbuktu. The training was focused on conventional military operations, military tactics, up to company level, empowering people, leaders to deliver outputs on the ground, weapons training, etc. I saw no evidence whatsoever of any training involved in respect of this particular assertion here that it was involved in managing migration, etc. That's been my experience, and I was there on 2 separate occasions.
Okay.
Yeah, just to echo that would be my first point. The EU training missions are military in nature. But to address the substance of the point, which I think is a fair one, like border policing, I would say in Africa, border policing accompanied by appropriate aid packages and development of civil society within those troubled countries is essential, because what you have, the people leaving are the brightest, the best and the bravest. And they're at considerable risk. And I think policing, in order to prevent them ending up as bodies being fished out lifeless from the Mediterranean, is a step in the right direction in regards to that. Because the uncontrolled type of migration that we're seeing is in nobody's interest, and it's certainly not theirs. And landing them into countries like ours, where up until recently we had appalling situations where people were arriving onto our soil and being given, I think, a small voucher for €25 and left to roam the streets of Dublin and be subject to the vagaries and threats of some of our less hospitable fellow citizens. Really, we want to see Africa get on its feet, and hemorrhaging its best and brightest and losing their lives is not, we can't ignore that.
Okay, thank you. Unless any of you want to come in, I'm going to go around for another second set of questions. You've been waiting, yes, I'm going to bring you in, and then the gentleman at the back, and then the lady at the front.
I'd just like to
say
that I agree completely with the fact that we should be allowing Africa to develop. But how are we going to do that? There's a huge elephant and herd of elephants in the room. One of them is the fact that we're taking the African resources. And then when the people whose resources we've taken for our extra development, after 500 years of imperial colonial development, when they try to come in, we operate Frontex, apartheid, which is what it is. It's an apartheid system. And at the back of it, if you dig far enough, despite the scales at the top, is white supremacism. And it's not new. It didn't start with Uncle Adolf. It goes back thousands of years. And we want to get that historical perspective on where we are. Or we'll just keep going down. And the other elephant is the unilateralism of Washington. Well, the Anglo-Washington axis of self-assumed morality. Yeah? this crusading spirit that we saw with Bush and Blair. And somebody spoke about totalitarianism. What is democratic about with us or against us? There's still policies operating. With us or against us is totalitarian.
I think I absolutely agree with you, and I just add to you that today that's happening in Ukraine.
NATO has taken over Europe and is trying to finish taking over the UN. If we join NATO instead of the UN, we're going into a flat earth scenario. But NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, now wants to reach as far as Taiwan, despite Washington's one China policy. So it's riddled with contradictions.
Do you have a question, sir?
Well, my question is, could we discuss that?
Okay.
Because that's an urgent situation.
Okay.
We're in constant world war, but any number you want on it.
And I think you raise a really important point about with us or against us, because I'd just like us to reflect in this panel and think about, what if Ukraine said to us, say if there was a ceasefire agreement, and what if Ukraine said, Ireland, you've been fabulous, you've taken on a lot of refugees, you've helped us, you've engaged, we'd like you to be part of a peacekeeping force or military ceasefire observation mission. What would our question be if Russia vetoed that? I'm not asking a question, but I'm saying back to the with us and against us perspective. And I want to bring in this gentleman here. This gentleman here has been waiting, and this lady here. So I'll do it this way. No, if you don't mind, you can do it in the next round.
Why can't we make comments? It's not a consultation.
It's just that there's a lot of people waiting, so if you can. But I'll try to bring you in a minute. Yeah.
Hi there. I'm Scott Fitzsimmons from the University of Limerick. I think there's been a lot of concern expressed about the kind of all or nothing nature of saying abandoning the triple lock. I think part of that concern is that Ireland would be sort of swept along in events, that we'd have less control over the use of our armed forces if we were to participate in missions that didn't have UN Security Council approval, that there'd be greater risk potentially to Irish troops, and that they may be engaged in activities that would not be salient with the Irish people or even the Irish government. I'm wondering if any of the panelists could comment on other methods that have been used, particularly in the last 20 years, by members of regional organizations to control the use of their troops. One of the most common terms for these control methods are caveats. So I'm wondering if you could speculate on how Ireland could use these caveats to control the use of its troops.
Thanks, that's a good question. I'll ask maybe the speaker just to explain that a bit, to clarify that. I think we had this lady waiting and then this man. Yes.
Hi, thanks very much, Senator Pauline O'Reilly. I'm the chair of the Green Party, and I'm also a member of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. So I believe that multilateralism is incredibly important. It's key for a small nation like ours, but it's also key for world peace. The OSCE, it's all about multilateralism. I mean, we sit in the room with parliamentarians from places that we don't really want to sit in the room with, and Russia is the most recent example earlier this year. And I think that we have to retain that ability to do that. But I mean, what's quite clear here is that regardless of which organisation we're part of, be that the EU, the UN, the OSCE, regardless, we are in a set of circumstances that are actually quite difficult, and that there are challenges with each one of those. And I suppose my question is, just trying to get to the nub of the issue here, is with or without the triple lock, are those organisations things that need to be reformed in order to better reflect that multilateralism that I think goes to the core of actually what Irish people want, and certainly what I want, because the UN's not doing the best job on it, the EU's not doing the best job on it, and I don't think that we can do it on our own.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. Sir, you have been waiting, sir. No. I thought you were getting lost again.
Past again. Everybody has read all the reports and everything else, but I generally find that reports are written that the author wants to bring you along the route that they want to go. I, on the other hand, took a slightly more unorthodox route. And I've had dinner, lunch, tea, whatever else with Al-Qaeda, Taliban, ISIS, Fatah al-Sham, Jabhat al-Nusra, PPK, YPK, Hezbollah, Hamas, Fatah, Islamic Jihad. And amazingly, they would all be on opposite sides of the battlefield from each other. But the one thing that they actually have in common was respect for Ireland. They actually respect Ireland. And we should use that to our advantage, because they respect our neutrality, they respect our non-interference, they also respect the triple lock, because the triple lock, you're not just asking the permanent five, you're asking the country that you're going to permission to go in, which is respect to the country that you're going to. Now, in respect to that, we'd say we are seen as a friendly country, and we are close to maybe a quarter way into this century, and this country has not seen a terrorist attack, unlike nearly every other country around the place. And I know there's people here that will be looking and kind of going, we've had a few close shaves, but if you look deep enough, you'll find that the heads up generally came from people inside these groups that didn't want to see Ireland getting hit, hurt or harmed. So I would say keep the triple lock and keep going. Now my question would be, if we do get rid of the triple lock, it would be the equivalent of tearing out and ripping up a huge portion of your insurance policy on the country. I understand that you're all looking at foreign policies and everything else, but you also have to look at the security of our own state. And this is part of the triple lock and everything else. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. There's quite a few questions there. Yes, Kieran, caveats.
Deal with a caveat. When a commanding officer is going overseas, he's presented with a document signed by the Minister for Defence which outlines precisely what his responsibilities are and what his responsibilities are to the force commander. However, that's not when you go to those areas, then there are certain restrictions placed. So, for example, to give you two examples, when I served in Chad, the caveat for Irish troops serving in Chad was that notwithstanding the fact that other forces use non-lethal means like rubber bullets to disperse crowds, we were not allowed to use that particular means of addressing a crowd issue. That was fully understood, and so therefore we didn't train in that particular arena, nor did we have the capability. In Chad, one of our key principles in respect of delivering operational outputs was impartiality. And at one juncture early on in the force headquarters directed that I would commence patrolling with an element of the Chadian armed forces. I believe that this ran contrary to the principles of neutrality. It would have endangered our troops significantly, and effectively I raised a red flag and said I would not do this particular tasking, and it was referred back to Dublin, ultimately to the OHQ in Paris, and I was proven correct to do so. So there are caveats that can be put in place by government, by the military, to ensure that everything conforms to international law and to normal processes in respect of delivering operational outputs.
And the UN's one request to countries is that they don't keep those hidden, that they say what the caveat is, they send it in paper, and it's clear what your troops won't do. What the difficulty is the debate around hidden caveats. You go off to the peacekeeping mission, then an emergency happens, you say there's been an attack on these civilians, can you engage? And somebody says, actually, no, we don't do that. And that is one of the challenges that UN peacekeeping faces. I don't know if you want to come in on some of these issues, Shamala.
Yeah, I'm not a military expert, so there's some things I'm not going to touch on. But on the sort of some of the questions, the points that have been made about regional organizations and the role they play, I just want to make a couple of points. I mean, what we're seeing is in some of the African countries that have UN peacekeeping, there's almost a preference to have the AU come in, and part of that is I think the AU is willing to play a more robust fighting role, including counterterrorism, which is not something UN peacekeeping would be doing. But there's also a question of I think the UN's been a little wary of just letting the AU take over, because the checks and balances that they feel need to be put in place. So I think if we're heading that way, if that's where peacekeeping is going, there needs to be some kind of framework that is better developed for the UN's involvement in it. I think if you have a situation in many African countries, or a few African countries, where there are mercenaries who are playing the role that the peacekeepers, should be playing, and some governments prefer that. So I feel there's a change on the ground that if regional organizations are going to go in, there needs to be a way to make sure that there's something in place. And as part of the EU, if Ireland were to go in, with an EU force, would there be a way to make sure that the EU as an organization has those checks and balances? And I'd say the same about the AU, but you probably wouldn't be involved with an AU force.
Okay, thank you. I want to also touch on, Ray, one question that this gentleman brought up when he talked about consent of the whole state. Yeah. Because he said that's enshrined in a UN mandate. Is it? Is it implicit? Is it explicit? And is consent? How important is consent of the whole state?
Okay, I mean, consent was central to the original concept of peacekeeping, what was referred to as Chapter 7, where you had an agreement of the parties to the deployment of a peacekeeping force, and it was something that we were very successful in doing. But, I mean, consent it's very complex. Like, for example, General Beery was out there in command of UNIFIL with the consent of the Lebanese government, and we're there with the consent of the Lebanese government. But who is the Lebanese government? There is no Lebanese government, really. And again, in theory, if you invoke Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, actually that authorizes the UN to deploy without the consent of a state. Now, in practice, that's an extremely dangerous thing to do. So when you're adopting the legal mechanism to dispense with consent, you still need to negotiate with the state. And the state, like for example Sudan, even though it consented to the Chapter 7 mission in Sudan and in Darfur, made it extremely difficult, logistically and otherwise, for the force to operate on the ground, and created restrictions on freedom of movement, etc. So consent is a fundamental principle, but the reality of consent is something much more complex, and it relates to just how complex these missions are. Many years ago, I interviewed a German general who was commanding the Kosovo force, and I asked him about how is he finding command and control, and he smiled at me benignly. I have no command. I just negotiate. I have these separate fiefdoms. It's like the Middle Ages, and these chieftains really determine what their government tells them to do. And so it's just to convey to people just how much more. The theory is fine, and the theory of caveats is great, but can you imagine when you have 10 or 12 different contingents, all with different conditions as to what you can do? How is a commander supposed to make an effective decision? So it's just they're all important, but it's the translating from, as Gerard Hearn said, you have those mandates of 20 pages long and anything and everything wish list in it, to something operational and effective on the ground. It's a big task.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And just in terms of thinking about triple lock alternatives, I just want to put it out there: would a host state request be sufficient for international legitimacy? It's a question.
No, but what about the situation where many of the host states where peacekeepers deploy are actually totalitarian, responsible for much, if not all, of the atrocities taking place. So, under no circumstances will I feel that the host state's request that you deploy would give it legitimacy. It's much, much more complex than that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We've a couple of questions coming in with a lot of different people voting for them. So I'm going to ask this question from Conor King. Has the triple lock been incorrectly or erroneously applied to recent non-combatant evacuation operations in Afghanistan and Sudan? Surely the presence or absence of a UN mandate is immaterial when bringing citizens safely home from conflict zones. So that's a question I'd like just your comments on, but I'm going to grab a few. Willie O'Day, former Defence Minister, wrote in the Sunday Independent that it's pointless debating the triple lock mechanism until the Defence Forces have the sufficient funding that they haven't had since the 2008 recession. Should investment come first? And there was another question on the number of troops that have been set at 12. Should we revisit? I think the Senator also brought up the question, should we revisit the number, the minimum number of troops that the triple lock requires? And sir, you were waiting here for a long time, so I'll let you come in also. And then I'm going to go back quickly to the panel.
Thank you. My name is Eamon Cusick, and I'm an ordinary citizen, hopefully speaking, and I think I am, on the silent majority. We've listened to a lot of comments this morning, and I first of all would like to support this forum. I think it's an excellent way of doing business, and we've heard an excellent debate there just now. And a citizen assembly is totally undemocratic and should not touch this. We have an elected government, and they should make a decision on this as soon as possible. Secondly, the whole question of neutrality is a red herring. We were never neutral. My father in 1940 was asked by the Irish government to go and collect American planes which crash landed in Balmullet and see them safely up north, as with the crews. And since then, we have had numerous different things where we haven't been neutral. We're only neutral because the government have not spent money on our armed services and have not a proper policy. And I would support fully that the Irish Army and the defence services should be properly funded. The report that was outlined there some time ago should be fully implemented, and stop waffling around about defence. It should be properly organised. The other point I'd like to make, and I know it's not proper or it's not nice, our President, his statement of a few days ago was absolutely ridiculous. The man, thank you very much.
I'm sorry, ma'am.
I have listened very patiently to you lot all morning. I have now got my right to say a few words. The President of Ireland made a statement which was totally outside the Constitution. He should not have done it, and the government, unfortunately, have not called him to task on this. And it is a very bad precedent for our democracy. And I won't go on about Sinn Féin and democracy and everything else. I would also, I'm coming to that now. I would also like to support the Ireland's full participation in the EU-led defence alliances. I know there's various ones. But I was taught back in the 1970s when we were going into the EU that we were full citizens of the EU and we should participate fully. We took their money, we took their money for farming, we took their money for infrastructure. We have now got a country that has full employment. We are a very prosperous, well-educated country, thanks to the EU. And in return, we turn our back on them when they come calling to us, which is description. And finally, on that point, I am supporting our call to go to NATO. Not everybody in this room is participating in the left alliance. The other point, the last point, and Chairperson, you made the point perfectly, but I didn't hear any answers. And the fact is, we have to get rid of this triple lock. It is only 20 years old, as Ray has said. It was given to us as a sop for the European vote. It has no basis whatsoever. We have an independent government. We should make up our own minds.
Okay, I'm going to
and what happens when, and hopefully very shortly, Ukraine win the war, Russia, and I know there's supporters of Russia here today, when Russia are kicked out, when we're asked to put a peacekeeping force on the border, we are asked to put peacekeeping force on the border, and the Russians stop it.
Thanks. I'm going to stop you off because I'm really conscious of space and timing there. A quick question to Ray first, and please try to answer also our colleagues online, and then Derek, Declan, and Kieran and Shamala to round it up, but keep it short if you can.
I'll keep it as short as possible. I think it's evident that I support the retention of the triple lock, but I don't see that the triple lock should have stopped Ireland sending Defence Forces personnel to evacuate citizens in peril somewhere. It's a separate question. It's the 2006 Defence Act needs to be amended to clarify this, because it's not. I'm not saying the Attorney General was wrong. It's, you know, the triple lock was never intended to affect such operational decisions. At least I believe so. I have to come in defence of the President. There's nothing in the Constitution which prohibits the President, as the first citizen of the state, making a comment. Now, there's references to conventions, and the Tánaiste is here, and he has respectfully not got involved in the debate, because I think he sees that constitutionally some of the roles of the President are not clearly set out. And as a first citizen, democratically elected directly by the population, I think he has every right, and he really did ignite this debate in a way which might not otherwise have happened, whether you agree or disagree with him.
Thanks, Ray. Declan.
Okay, just with regards, just a comment about the triple lock that continues our conversation with regards to equality, before I forget it. I think we're getting very fixated on it as an instrument of oversight, and I get that, fair enough. But we should remember, whatever decision we come to on it, oversight should not end with the triple lock, because there are various UN missions that have been responsible for human rights abuses. I served under an Irish general who literally tore his hair out because of human rights abuse against children by one contingent, and the UN were doing nothing about it. So we should be aware, oversight is a continuous thing, whatever decision we make. Conor King asked a very valid question. Conor is referring to something known as the ECATs, the Emergency Civil Assistance Teams, that have been designed to bring civil, military and other resources together to protect Irish citizens. It is not appropriate for the triple lock to look at that. We should have no cap on the necessary figure. Obviously, it has to be realistic. But we should be using our armed forces exist to primarily protect the citizens of Ireland, wherever they are. And we should use our resources appropriately. And we shouldn't need to seek permission from anybody. One thing I would say, though, is we neglect the fact that PESCO allows us to have access to a European airlift capacity. We should be making use of it for these kinds of situations.
Okay, thanks. Kieran,
very briefly, could I say that in relation to the triple lock, I strongly believe that without a UN Security Council resolution, our elected government, democratic government, should have the power to, on a case-by-case basis, decide to send troops in a humanitarian situation. We sent a warship to the Mediterranean for 3 years without any UN mandate to rescue migrants in the Mediterranean. In relation to Deputy O'Dee's question in relation to resources, the report on the Defence Force has been presented. There is a high-level plan in place. I'm very confident that monies will be spent on the Defence Forces. Critically, the biggest challenge is our recruitment. And I would say to everybody here, notwithstanding negative publicity that has been put about by the Defence Forces, it's still a wonderful organisation, delivers wonderful career opportunity to young men and women, and I hope that they will continue to join the Defence Forces in the coming months and years.
Thank you. Shamala, last word.
Very, very briefly. I mean, I'll just leave you with the thought about, we talked about peacekeeping today, how it's changed, to think about where it's heading, what it might look like in 10 years. I think the multi-dimensional big peacekeeping missions, they are on their way out, whether it's regional. I think how that affects the triple lock, if it stays in place, is a question to think about as you debate this.
And with apologies to you all for running over lunch, but thank you for your intervention and thank you for your respectful interventions and engagements. It's been very helpful. Thanks to all who participated online and thanks to our panel.